Tonight we're venturing deep into the heart of Texas, where lonely highways stretch for miles, and the only thing darker than the asphalt is what waits just beyond the headlights. These are 20 terrifying true encounters on dark country roads in Texas. Stories whispered by truckers, travelers, and locals who swore they'd never speak of what they saw again. But before we begin, here's something strange. Most viewers make one huge mistake: they leave without subscribing. And by doing so, they miss out on the creepiest, spine-tingling tales that only the bravest dare to hear. Don't be one of them. Hit that subscribe button now, because tonight's just the beginning and the terror waiting in the darkness is far from over. So tell me, where are you watching from? And what time is it there? Let me know in the comments, because on these Texas backroads, the night never truly ends and something is always watching from the shadows. Now turn off the lights, lock your doors, and let's drive straight into the darkness. I never thought I'd talk about that night, mostly because I've never found a way to make it make sense, even to myself. I was driving back from a delivery job out in Terlingua, cutting across that lonely stretch of FM 170 that threads through the desert like a vein of silver under the moonlight. It was close to midnight in late September, the kind of night when the wind moves so slow it feels like the earth itself is holding its breath. I had been on the road for almost 8 hours and hadn't seen another car for at least 45 minutes. The silence was almost comforting at first, the hum of my tires and the occasional rattle of loose tools in the backseat being the only sounds keeping me company. There's something about driving long distances alone at night that messes with your head. The dark starts to take on a shape and the highway lines start to blur. I remember thinking I should pull over soon and stretch my legs before I got too tired. The next town was Lajitas, maybe 30 miles ahead, but I doubted there'd be much open at that hour. I wasn't in a rush. The desert stretched on all sides, quiet and endless. Then I saw it, a floodlight cutting through the black, mounted high on a pole beside what looked like a closed maintenance station, or maybe a rest stop. It wasn't marked on my GPS, but out there things like that weren't unusual. At first I only meant to stop for a minute, maybe check my tires and splash some water on my face. The floodlight gave me enough visibility to park safely off the shoulder. As I slowed down, the beam illuminated a figure standing just beneath it, a woman, tall, wearing what looked like a long dress that shifted slightly in the wind. She was facing away from me, her hair hanging loose down her back. For a second I thought she might be in trouble. There was no car, no sign of movement, just her standing perfectly still beneath that light like she'd been waiting for something. I rolled my window halfway down and called out to her. "Ma'am, you okay out here?" My voice sounded too loud against the silence. She didn't turn around or move at all. I felt that prickling sensation, the one that crawls up the back of your neck when you realize something about a situation isn't right. Still, I got out of the truck, leaving the engine idling. The crunch of gravel under my boots was the only sound as I walked closer. That's when I noticed her shadow. The floodlight cast a hard, clean beam, sharp enough that even my own shadow stretched crisp and dark across the ground. But hers didn't move. It stayed perfectly still, frozen in place even as her dress swayed faintly and her hair stirred. I took another step and realized her shadow wasn't aligned right either. It was facing a different direction, like it belonged to something else entirely. I stopped where I was, about 20 feet away. "Do you need help?" I asked again, my voice quieter this time. The air felt thicker somehow, as if sound didn't carry properly under that light. Finally, she turned her head, just enough for me to see the curve of her cheek and the edge of one eye, glinting strangely in the harsh white glow. It wasn't a normal glance. It was slow, deliberate, like she was aware of every muscle she was moving, and even as she turned, the shadow didn't. It remained facing forward, arms at its sides, unmoving. Every instinct in me screamed to leave. But something about her, the way she stood there alone in the middle of nowhere, kept me rooted. I told myself maybe the shadow thing was just an illusion, some trick of the light. Maybe I was tired and imagining it. But then she spoke, her voice was soft, barely audible. "You shouldn't stop here." The words were simple, but the tone made them sound wrong, like she wasn't warning me for my safety, but for something else's benefit. I took a half step back, scanning the area around us. Nothing, just scrub brush, dirt, and the faraway outline of the Chisos Mountains. The floodlight buzzed faintly overhead, insects flickering through the beam. "Are you hurt?" I asked, more out of habit than sense. She turned more fully now, and I could see her face clearly. She looked young, maybe mid-20s, pale under the light, but her eyes were what caught me. Dark, almost too dark, like the pupils had swallowed the rest. Her expression didn't change, but her lips parted slightly as if she wanted to say something else. Instead, she lifted her arm and pointed toward the darkness beyond the light's edge. I looked where she pointed, and for the first time I noticed another figure, faint, half hidden beyond the reach of the light. It looked like someone crouched low to the ground, maybe another person, maybe not. I couldn't make out features, just the outline. My chest tightened. When I looked back at the woman, she was closer than before. I hadn't seen her move. She was just there, a few steps nearer, her hair now brushing her shoulders, her head tilted slightly. "You shouldn't have stopped," she said again. Same tone, same stillness. That broke whatever hold I was under. I turned and started backing toward my truck, keeping my eyes on her. As I reached the door, I saw movement from the corner of my eye. The crouched shape in the dark was standing now, tall and unsteady, swaying slightly. The floodlight flickered once, and when it steadied again, both of them were gone. I jumped into the cab and slammed the door, locking it out of instinct. The truck's headlights cut through the dust, but there was no one there. Just the empty road and the white pole with its buzzing light. My hands were shaking as I shifted into drive, and that's when I saw it in the rearview mirror. She was standing behind my truck, directly under the floodlight again, exactly where she'd been the first time. Same position, same stillness. Only this time her shadow was gone. I didn't wait. I pressed the gas and didn't let up until the light disappeared completely from my mirrors. For a long time afterward, I tried to convince myself it was fatigue, a trick of the eyes after hours of driving. But the next morning when I stopped for gas near Presidio, I told the station clerk about it. He froze mid-sentence when I mentioned the floodlight. Said there used to be a rest station there years ago, but it had burned down after a woman was killed, hit by a passing truck whose driver claimed he thought she was already standing under the light. They tore down the building, but the light still comes on at night, even though there's no power line running to it anymore. He said a lot of travelers see her, especially those driving alone. Some stop, some keep going. I've driven that route a dozen times since, but I've never seen that light again. Still, every time I pass that stretch of FM 170, I can't help glancing in the mirror, because sometimes, just for a second, I think I see a figure standing there, still and quiet beneath a glow that shouldn't exist. Her face turned toward me, waiting, and every time I drive a little faster, telling myself it's just the road playing tricks, though deep down I know the road remembers. I never believed in the stories about Devil's Backbone until that night. My friend Caleb and I were driving back from San Marcos to Canyon Lake after a late party near the university. It was close to midnight when we decided to take the scenic route, the winding stretch of FM 32 known as Devil's Backbone. Locals always said the road never ends the same way twice, that the route shifts somehow. I laughed when Caleb mentioned it, but even then something about the air that night felt off. It was too still, too quiet for the hill country. No cicadas, no wind moving through the cedar, just the soft hum of our old truck's engine and the faint glow of the dashboard. We'd been on that road plenty of times before, but it felt different this time. The darkness seemed thicker, almost alive, the headlights only reaching a few feet before being swallowed whole. I remember thinking it was strange how empty it was. No oncoming cars, no distant taillights, just endless black ribbon twisting through limestone hills. Then Caleb spotted something, a figure up ahead standing on the shoulder. He slowed down instinctively, squinting through the windshield. "You see that?" he said. The man was tall and thin, wearing what looked like an old military jacket. His face was mostly hidden by the shadow of a cap. I thought maybe he'd broken down somewhere. Maybe his car was hidden behind the bend. Against my better judgment, Caleb pulled over. The man stepped closer to the passenger side and I rolled the window down halfway. His voice was calm, almost polite. "Evening. Headed toward Wimberley?" I hesitated, but Caleb nodded. The man smiled faintly. "Appreciate it. My name's Richard." He climbed into the back seat without another word. The smell hit me first, the old leather and something metallic like rust or dried blood. We started driving again, trying to make small talk. He said he'd served in the Marines, that he'd been stationed overseas years ago. His voice had this strange weight to it, like every word came from far away. At one point I asked where his car was, and he chuckled softly. "Didn't bring one," he said. "Just needed to get home." That answer stuck with me. There were no houses for miles out there, just scattered ranch gates and the occasional barbed wire fence. Caleb turned to me, mouthing the words, "Let's drop him soon." I nodded, but before we could say anything, Richard spoke again, as if he'd heard us. "Don't worry. It won't be much longer." The road started to change. I know how that sounds, but it's the truth. The curves didn't match what I remembered. There was no sign for Fisher or any of the usual markers. Just an endless two-lane strip surrounded by dead trees that hadn't been there before. Even the stars were gone. Just a dull gray sky pressing down on us. Caleb gripped the wheel tighter. "GPS says we're still on 32, he said. But when I checked my phone, there was no signal. The time on the screen had frozen at 12:14 a.m. I felt a wave of nausea roll through me, like we'd been driving in circles for hours. Richard leaned forward between the seats, his cold breath brushing my neck. "You know," he said softly, "they built this road over a battlefield. Men died out here long before there was pavement. That's why it never rests." I turned around to look at him, but he wasn't there. The backseat was empty. I stared, blinking, thinking maybe he'd crouched down. Then the smell hit again, stronger now, rotting and heavy. Caleb slammed the brakes, the truck fishtailing on the gravel shoulder. "He's gone," he shouted. We jumped out, scanning the road, but there was no one. We stood there listening. The silence was unbearable. Then faintly we heard it, footsteps behind us crunching slowly along the shoulder. They circled the truck once, then stopped. The air turned icy, and the engine sputtered even though the keys were still in Caleb's hand. The headlights flickered, dimmed, then surged back to life. And for a split second I saw him again, standing in the beam just ahead, face pale and eyes empty. He lifted one hand and pointed toward the hills. "That's where I died," he whispered. The sound wasn't coming from his mouth. It was inside my head, layered and distorted like a dozen voices speaking through one throat. Then the lights cut out completely. I don't remember how long we sat there, frozen. When the lights came back, the road looked normal again. The trees were alive, the stars visible. The clock on my phone read 3:47 a.m. Somehow more than 3 hours had passed. We drove the rest of the way in silence, refusing to look in the mirrors. When we finally reached Wimberley, the gas station attendant looked at us like we'd crawled out of a grave. He told us something I'll never forget. Said we weren't the first to pick up a man like that. Soldiers, hikers, couples, all reported the same hitchhiker on Devil's Backbone. Always around midnight, always vanishing before dawn. They say he's one of the lost. Men who died in a wagon ambush during the Civil War trying to get home. His body was never found. Caleb doesn't talk about it anymore. He sold the truck a few weeks later. As for me, I tried driving that road again once in daylight. It was shorter than I remembered. Only a few miles between Ranch Road 12 and Highway 281. But at one point near a limestone ridge, I saw a single boot lying in the ditch, cracked leather caked in old red dust. When I picked it up, I found a name carved inside the lining. It said R. Haynes, USMC. That night, I locked it in the trunk and drove home without stopping. But every now and then, when I check my rearview mirror, I swear I see someone sitting in the back seat, just for a second before the road bends and he disappears again. Highway 59 runs quiet after midnight. It stretches long and black between the pine woods, the kind of road where truckers tell stories just to keep themselves awake. I've been running freight between Houston and Lufkin for 20 years, and I've heard them all. Ghost lights, phantom hitchhikers, weird things seen in the fog near Livingston. But the one that always sticks is the old bridge over the dry riverbed just north of Shepherd. The locals call it Devil's Crossing, though that's not its real name. Supposedly, if you park under it at 3 in the morning, you'll hear children whispering from below, begging someone to turn the lights back on. I didn't believe it, of course. Truck stops breed rumors the way graveyards breed moss, but curiosity has a way of eating at you mile by mile, especially when the road's dark and empty and the only sound is the steady hum of your tires. One night about 6 months ago, I decided I'd find out for myself. I'd been running late out of Houston. A storm had passed through, leaving the air thick and cool, the pavement still shining wet under my headlights. I hit the bridge a little after 2:30. The road there narrows and dips, and there's an old service road that runs down beneath it to a wide patch of dirt, where people used to pull off and rest before the county blocked it off. I eased my rig down that incline, gravel crunching under my tires, and rolled to a stop right under the bridge. The engine's rumble filled the space like thunder trapped in concrete. When I shut it off, the silence felt heavier than it should have. It's strange how quiet it gets out there. You'd think you'd still hear crickets or frogs from the brush, but there was nothing. Just the soft dripping of rainwater from the bridge joints, echoing down into the empty riverbed. I checked my watch. 2:47, close enough, I thought. I left my running lights on so I could see around the cab and stepped out. The air smelled like wet clay and rust. My boots sank a little in the soft dirt as I walked toward the edge of the bridge shadow. I expected the sound of water, but the riverbed was dry, just a stretch of cracked earth and weeds. I leaned on the railing, listening. For a while, there was only the wind shifting through the trees. Then faintly I thought I heard something else, like a whisper too far to make out. At first I figured it was wind funneling through the concrete supports, but then the tone changed. It was rhythmic, soft, almost like voices. I crouched down, trying to pinpoint where it came from, and realized it was rising from the dirt below. My heart kicked up and I froze, straining to listen. It sounded like children, not laughing or crying, but talking. Their voices low and urgent, overlapping. I couldn't make out words at first, just a pattern of breathy sounds too faint to be wind. I tried to tell myself it was my imagination, that it was air moving through pipes or some trick of acoustics. But then I heard a sentence clear as day. "Please turn the lights back on." The words were so distinct they snapped me upright. I stared down at the empty riverbed, my pulse thudding in my neck. There was no one there, just pale mud and the skeleton of a shopping cart caught in a tangle of brush. But the voices kept coming, rising and falling like a tide. Children's voices pleading, repeating the same phrase over and over. "Please turn the lights back on." The air grew colder. I backed up toward my truck, keeping my eyes on the dirt below. I half expected to see someone crawl up the embankment. Instead, the whispering stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I climbed into the cab, shut the door, and started the engine, eager for the comfort of sound. But as I reached for the shifter, I heard something slap against the side of my trailer. Once, then again, harder. I jumped out, flashlight in hand. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating the metal side of the trailer. Mud streaks, fresh ones, small handprints smeared across the lower panels. They led toward the rear bumper, where a thick patch of clay was scuffed like someone had been clawing to climb up. I wiped one with my glove. It was damp, real. My stomach turned. I ran the light across the ground and saw the same prints leading back toward the riverbed. They stopped just at the point where the dirt dipped into shadow. I thought about calling the sheriff, but what would I say? That a bunch of ghost kids smeared mud on my truck? They'd laugh me out of the county. So I did the only thing that made sense. I got back in and drove off fast. I didn't stop until I hit Lufkin. Pulled into the lot behind the diner I always hit before dawn, parked under the sodium lights, and climbed out. The prints were gone. The trailer was spotless. Even the mud I'd smeared on my glove was gone. I told myself maybe I'd imagined it all, that I was just tired and spooked by truck stop folklore. I wanted to believe that, and for a while I did. Then came the second night. I wasn't planning to go near the bridge again, but some detour rerouted me down 59. By the time I realized it, I was already passing Shepherd. The air was hazy, low fog clinging to the asphalt, and I swear I didn't mean to look, but I did. Down in the shadow under the bridge, I saw lights flickering, faint and bluish like someone moving with a lantern. I slowed, thinking maybe another trucker had pulled off, but the light moved wrong, sliding side to side too fast, like a reflection on water that wasn't there. The moment I passed the span, my radio crackled with static, then a voice came through. It was faint, thin, high-pitched. "Please turn the lights back on." I slammed the radio off. The cab felt colder than the air outside. I didn't touch that dial again until I hit Nacogdoches. Word got around soon after. Other truckers started talking about hearing the same thing. A guy named Hank swore he saw kids standing knee-deep in the dry riverbed, waving as he passed. Another claimed his dash cam caught faces pressed up against his windshield for half a second, before the feed glitched out. A few tried parking there deliberately, but none lasted long. They'd come back pale, shaking, saying they heard splashing that wasn't possible in a river without water, or footsteps circling the truck though the ground was dry and still. Curiosity gnawed at me again. Stupid, I know, but I needed to understand. So one night I parked there again. This time I left every light off and killed the engine. The darkness was absolute and the quiet so thick it rang in my ears. I sat there in the cab, window cracked, waiting. When the first whisper came, I didn't jump. It was softer this time, almost gentle. "Please, turn the lights back on." I whispered back before I could stop myself. "What lights?" For a second, nothing. Then a sound like rustling leaves filled the air, and I realized it wasn't leaves, it was water. The dry riverbed was moving. I looked out, and under the faint glow of the bridge lamps, the earth shimmered, rippling like the reflection of headlights on a wet road. And in that rippling, I saw them, small shapes rising from the dirt, pale, translucent, like figures caught beneath the surface of a pond. Children, dozens of them. Their faces upturned, eyes hollow, mouths moving in unison. "Turn the lights back on." I started the engine. The headlights flooded the riverbed, and the figures vanished instantly. The rippling stopped. The ground looked solid again, but my truck wouldn't move. The wheels spun uselessly like I'd sunk into mud. Then the lights flickered. Once, twice, then out. Everything went black. In that pitch dark, I heard the doors rattle, the windows shake, little fists pounding from outside, voices overlapping in a chorus of whispers. "We can't see. Please turn the lights back on." Something pressed its face against the glass beside me. For an instant, I saw it. Gray skin stretched thin, eyes glowing faintly blue, water dripping from its mouth, though there was none to drip from. I turned the key again, desperate. The engine roared to life, the lights snapped back on, and the figure vanished. The truck lurched free, tires spitting mud that hadn't been there before. I didn't stop until daylight. The next morning, I found out what really happened out there. Back in the 70s, before they rerouted the main bridge, there'd been a school bus accident. Heavy rain, bad brakes, and the driver lost control. The bus went off the old bridge and straight into the flooded river. 23 kids drowned before rescue could reach them. The story goes the headlights shorted out when the bus hit the water, and in the dark they panicked, calling out for someone to turn the lights back on. They never found all the bodies. I don't drive 59 much anymore. When I do, I make sure I'm past that stretch long before 3. But sometimes late at night when the road hums beneath my tires and the radio starts to hiss with static, I catch faint words hidden in the noise. "Please turn the lights back on." And no matter how bright my cab is lit, I can feel the dark pressing just outside, waiting for me to stop. It started as one of those small, harmless mysteries you don't think much about at first. The kind that sits quietly in the back of your mind until it starts to feel like something's watching you from there. I worked as a ranch hand about 10 miles outside Gonzales, on a spread that had been in the same family for 3 generations. Cattle mostly, with some horses and a couple of mules that were meaner than sin. The kind of job that has you up before dawn and dead tired by sunset. Most nights I was too worn out to care about anything but sleep. But for about 3 weeks straight, something kept messing with me in a way I still can't explain. Every morning the north gate was open, always the same one. It wasn't a big gate, just a metal cattle gate leading out to the mesquite pasture. But it had a heavy latch that you had to lift and twist. Not something that'd swing open on its own. The first time it happened, I figured I'd just forgotten to latch it after feeding the herd. It happens. But when I found it open again the next morning, I started paying attention. By the third morning, when I was sure I'd double-checked it the night before, I started getting uneasy. Coyotes couldn't lift that latch. Neither could the wind. I told my boss, Old Man Hawthorne, and he just laughed. Said some of the neighbor kids were probably playing a prank. Gonzales had its share of bored teenagers who liked to mess with ranchers. But I couldn't imagine them driving all the way out here every single night just to open one gate and leave without stealing or tagging anything. Still, I went along with it. I even locked the gate with a chain the next night, wrapping it tight and clicking the padlock shut. At dawn, the gate was open again. Chain hanging loose, padlock gone. That's when I bought a trail cam. Nothing fancy, just one of those motion-activated hunting cams you strap to a fence post. I aimed it right at the latch, about shoulder height, and made sure it was working. I even checked it with my flashlight that night before turning in. The next morning, sure enough, the gate was wide open again. I tried to convince myself it was someone from town, maybe some drifter walking through the fields. But when I pulled the SD card from the camera and plugged it into my laptop, my stomach turned to ice. The screen showed nothing for the first few hours. Just grainy black and white stills of the gate sitting there in the dark. Then at 2:43 a.m., something moved at the edge of the frame. At first it looked like fog, but the weather had been dry as bone. Then the fog seemed to take on shape, tall, thin, and shifting like a person stepping out of nowhere. The image sharpened just enough for me to see that it wasn't really a person. It was more like a shadow that wasn't attached to anything, just a darker patch of night that bent around the light. It moved toward the gate. One of the bars creaked slightly in the footage. The latch lifted. The gate swung open slow and steady, the same way I'd do it by hand. The shadow slipped through the opening and the camera flickered before cutting out completely. When the feed came back a few minutes later, the gate was wide open and the pasture beyond it was still. Nothing else happened the rest of the night. I didn't tell Hawthorne that part. I just said the camera didn't catch anyone. He'd have said I was crazy and maybe I was starting to believe it myself. But something about that footage wouldn't leave me alone. I went back out that evening right before sunset and stood by that same gate with the camcorder in my hand. The pasture stretched quiet in front of me. Yellow grass swaying under a blood-orange sky, the smell of dust and manure thick in the air. I walked a few feet past the gate into the field. The ground there was uneven, soft from years of cattle hooves. And that's when I saw them. Boot prints, barely visible in the dirt. Not mine, not Hawthorne's, too narrow for either of us. They led from the gate straight toward the mesquite grove where the light barely reached. I followed them for maybe 50 feet before they faded. I stood there listening. Nothing but cicadas and the distant lowing of cattle. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing that moment on the video when the shadow lifted the latch. Around 2 a.m. I gave up and grabbed my flashlight. I told myself I was just going to check the gate one more time. Maybe I'd catch whoever or whatever it was in the act. The air was heavy when I stepped outside, thick with that strange stillness that comes before a storm even when there's no rain coming. My boots crunched over the dry dirt as I made my way down the fence line. The flashlight beam bounced off the wire, catching little glints of dew. When I reached the gate, it was closed, latch secure. I stood there in the dark waiting. Minutes dragged by. The wind whispered through the grass. Somewhere far off, a cow lowed softly. I was about to turn back when I heard it. A metallic click, like the sound of a latch being lifted. But it wasn't coming from the gate in front of me. It came from the next pasture over where another gate stood leading down toward the old creek bed. I started walking. Slow, careful steps. The beam of my flashlight shook slightly in my hand. As I got closer, I could see that the second gate was swinging open. Not fast, not jerky. Smooth, deliberate, like someone was easing it just enough to pass through, but I couldn't see anyone there. The grass didn't move. The dust didn't stir. Then, just as the gate stopped moving, the flashlight flickered. I smacked it once and the beam steadied, but the gate was closed again. My heart was hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. I backed up slowly, scanning the fence line. That's when something brushed against the back of my neck. Cold, light as breath. I spun around. Nothing. Just the outline of the ranch house faint against the distance. I started walking back, trying to tell myself it was just the wind. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, matching my steps. By the time I reached the house, I was sweating even though the night was cool. I locked every door, something I'd never done before. Around sunrise, I finally drifted off in my chair. When I woke up, the first thing I did was check the window. The gate, both of them, were wide open. I quit 2 days later, told Hawthorne my truck was acting up and I needed to head back home to San Marcos for a while. He didn't question it. Before I left, though, I couldn't help checking the trail cam one last time. The battery light was dead, but I pulled the SD card anyway. There were only 3 images from that night. The first showed the gate, closed and latched. The second showed it wide open. And the third, well, that one showed me. I was standing there in front of the gate, flashlight pointed toward the ground, my face just barely visible. And behind me, stretching up out of the grass, was that same shadow I'd seen before. Only this time it wasn't shapeless anymore. It had arms, shoulders, a head tilted slightly toward mine, almost resting against it, like it was whispering something into my ear. I deleted the footage and left Gonzales before sunset. I've never been back, but every so often, when I drive through the hill country at night, I see cattle fences along the road, and sometimes, just for a second, I'll catch sight of a gate swinging open on its own. I was halfway home from my night shift at the hospital in Beeville when I saw him. The clock on my dashboard read 3:42 a.m., and the road ahead stretched out empty and wet from a drizzle that had started around midnight. FM 666 was one of those rural stretches of blacktop, that looked the same for miles. Mesquite trees on either side, barbed wire fencing, a random mailbox every half-mile if that. I'd driven it hundreds of times, always with the radio low, coffee cooling in the cup holder, headlights cutting through that heavy South Texas humidity that hung like a film over the windshield. But that night something felt different. The fog was thicker than usual, rolling in from the low fields, and the air had that quiet weight that makes you feel like you're driving underwater. I had just come around the curve where 2 nights earlier I'd hit a deer, a big buck that had leapt out of nowhere. The impact had been brutal. I pulled over shaking, called the sheriff's department, and they'd sent a deputy to help drag the carcass off the road. I remembered the sound it made as we pulled it. Heavy, wet, like dragging soaked fabric over gravel. The deputy said I was lucky, that plenty of folks had lost control and wound up flipped in the ditch. I drove home that night with the smell of blood and radiator fluid in my nose, barely able to look at that stretch of road when I passed it again. So when I saw a man standing there now, waving his arms, I almost didn't slow down. He was in the same exact spot where the deer had fallen, right there by the broken section of fence where the mesquite leaned out toward the road. I tapped the brakes out of instinct, thinking maybe he'd wrecked his truck, maybe he needed help. But something about how still everything was made the hair rise on the back of my neck. His clothes were dark and looked soaked through, and when my headlights hit him, I saw his face for half a second before he threw his arm up to block the light. Pale, tired, like he hadn't slept in days, he didn't move out of the way as I slowed down. Just stood there, hand raised, mouth moving like he was saying something I couldn't hear. I stopped about 20 feet ahead and rolled the window down a crack. The smell of wet asphalt and mesquite blew in, mixed with something faintly metallic. "You okay?" I called out. My voice sounded smaller than I expected. He didn't answer, just took a few steps closer. My high beams caught the water dripping from his clothes, glinting like oil. His expression didn't change. He just kept walking toward the car. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach turn. The fence behind him, the one the deer had busted through, was bent inward this time, as if something had pushed out from the field toward the road. I know that fence had been fixed yesterday morning. The rancher across the way worked quick, always patching it up with new wire and posts. But now it was torn again, fresh, the metal edges shining in my headlights. I felt a strong, sudden urge to drive away. The man was close enough now that I could see his eyes. They didn't look right. There was no white in them, just this grayish film, like fog had settled inside. He opened his mouth as if to speak, and what came out wasn't a voice but a strained wheeze, like someone forcing air through water. I slammed the car into gear, but before I could hit the gas, he reached out and touched the hood with one hand. My engine sputtered and died instantly. I froze. The radio cut off. The dash lights flickered. All I could hear was the ticking of cooling metal and the rain pattering on the windshield. The man's hand stayed on the hood, his head tilted like he was listening to something under the car. Then, without warning, he dropped to his knees and started crawling underneath. I screamed and hit the horn, but it didn't make a sound. The headlights dimmed and went black. The silence that followed was suffocating. I grabbed my phone, tried to turn on the flashlight, but the screen stayed black. I don't know how long I sat there breathing shallowly, waiting for something to happen. I didn't want to look out the window, but I had to. When I did, I saw movement in the fog ahead of the car, shapes like several figures walking across the road in slow, uneven strides. They were all soaked, their clothes clinging to them like seaweed. I realized they weren't walking on the pavement, but just above it, their feet not touching the ground. One of them turned its head, and I saw the glint of antlers in the fog. I slammed the lock button on the door like that would do anything, and started praying out loud. Then, out of nowhere, the car engine coughed and roared back to life on its own. The headlights came back, blindingly bright, and in that instant everything outside vanished. No man, no figures, just the empty road and the fence bent inward. I threw it into drive and sped away as fast as I could, heart pounding so hard I could taste blood in my mouth. I didn't slow down until I reached the intersection with Highway 181, where there's an old convenience store that stays open all night. I pulled in shaking so bad I could barely open the door. The clerk inside looked up as I came in, drenched in sweat. He asked if I was okay, and I told him I thought someone was out there on 666, maybe a man who'd been in an accident. He frowned and said, "You mean near the Castillo Ranch?" I nodded. He said, "That's where that nurse hit a guy last week. Killed him instantly. Thought he was a deer at first. I just stared at him. What? I asked. He nodded slowly. Yeah, sheriff came through here talking about it. Said it happened late at night. Poor guy had wandered onto the road from the field. They said she never saw him until the last second. I told him I was that nurse, that I'd hit a deer. He looked confused, said he was sure it was a man. I ran back out to my car before he could say anything else. My headlights were still on, the engine still idling. But when I glanced down at the hood, there was a handprint smeared across the paint. Dark, streaked with something brownish red that had already begun to dry. I called the sheriff the next morning. Told him what the clerk had said, what I'd seen. He didn't laugh, didn't call me crazy. He just asked me to come down to the station. When I did, he showed me photos from the accident scene. The body had been found tangled in the fence where I'd thought the deer had landed. The impact had broken the posts inward, not outward. And the man's clothes were soaked through from the rain that night. They never found the deer. I still drive FM 666 sometimes, but only during the day. At night, I take the long way around through Goliad, even if it adds an hour. Because every time I pass that curve, I swear I can feel the car hesitate, like it remembers the place. And once when I stopped at a light back in Beeville, I looked in my rearview mirror and saw muddy fingerprints on the inside of the back window trailing downward, as if someone had been trying to climb out. I never believed places could move. I thought that was the kind of nonsense people posted online to scare tourists or drum up ghost stories. I'd been to Big Bend 4 times before that summer, always staying around the Chisos Basin, hiking the same switchbacks, the same canyons. I knew that park like a second home, but what happened on the Lost Mine Trail in June of 2022 made me realize that land isn't as stable as we think. Some trails don't just lead you somewhere. Some pull you in. It was my girlfriend Jess's idea to hike it before sunrise. She wanted to watch the desert light up from the overlook. We started at 4 in the morning with headlamps, 1 thermos of coffee, and that dry, chalky smell of dust and cedar in the air. The sky was violet, stars fading fast, and the only sound was wind moving through the canyon below. It was quiet enough that we could hear each other's breathing. I remember thinking how peaceful it felt. No one else on the trail, just us, the wind, and that faint shimmer of dawn behind Casa Grande Peak. Lost Mine Trail isn't long, maybe 5 miles round trip, but it's a steady climb, and those switchbacks zigzag across steep slopes. You can see the road twisting far below, like a thin ribbon of silver. About 20 minutes in, Jess stopped and looked behind us. "Did we pass that rock before?" she asked. It was this tall spire of limestone, kind of shaped like a fang sticking out of the hillside. I told her maybe there were a few that looked similar. The Chisos are full of weird rock shapes. She didn't seem convinced, but shrugged and kept walking. We took a break by a dead juniper tree around 4:30. The air was getting warmer, but there was still that thin chill of desert night hanging on. I remember taking a sip of coffee, looking back down the trail and noticing something off. The switchback we just climbed didn't look right. It wasn't where it should have been. It curved in the opposite direction, leading us toward a different ridge. I blinked and it was fine again. Just normal. I didn't say anything because I figured my eyes were just adjusting to the dark. By the time the sun came up, we were halfway up. The desert below turned gold and pink, and Jess kept stopping to take photos. Around then, we started hearing something faint. It sounded like footsteps behind us, crunching lightly on gravel. We turned around a few times, but didn't see anyone. The parking lot had only 1 other car when we arrived, so maybe another couple had started later. Still, the sound came and went, always just out of sync with ours. It wasn't until the 4th switchback that Jess noticed it too. We'd stop, and so would the sound. We'd start again, and it would follow. Sometimes closer, sometimes farther. The hair on the back of my neck was standing up. The trail was narrow, bordered by steep drop-offs on one side and thick brush on the other. There wasn't anywhere to hide. When I called out, my voice came back hollow and thin, like shouting into a cave. We reached a section with a stone bench built into the slope. That's where everything changed. Jess pointed ahead and said, "Wait, this isn't right." The trail curved sharply left where it should have gone right toward the ridge. I checked the GPS on my phone. It showed us still on the trail, but the line on the map bent differently now, tracing a route that didn't exist before. I laughed nervously, said maybe the signal was off. But then we turned around to head back down, and the trail behind us was gone. Not erased exactly, just shifted. The switchbacks weren't the same. The angle of the slope, the rocks, the tree line. It all looked subtly rearranged, like someone had taken the landscape apart and put it back together wrong. The bench we'd just sat on wasn't there anymore. In its place was a cluster of agave plants. Jess said my name, her voice tight. She was shaking. "It's different," she whispered. "Everything's different." We tried following what looked like the path downhill, but it kept veering left, leading us along a narrow ledge. The sound of footsteps started again, only now it wasn't behind us. It was below us, somewhere down the slope, crunching through loose stone. Then a voice called out. It wasn't loud, but it carried clear through the still air. A man's voice, calm and low, saying something like, "Keep going." We froze. I shouted back, asking if he was okay. No reply. Just the wind brushing through the brush and that voice again, softer this time. "Keep going." Jess grabbed my arm and pulled me forward. She didn't want to wait. The trail kept bending, but no matter how long we walked, the distance on my GPS never changed. We were always 2.4 miles from the overlook. I thought maybe the phone was stuck, but then I realized the light was wrong too. The sun hung at the same height for what felt like hours, casting long shadows that never moved. The silence was heavier now, broken only by our breathing and those shifting footsteps, sometimes ahead, sometimes to the side. Around midday, if it even was midday, we found ourselves back at that same dead juniper. Or maybe another that looked like it. The bark was split open the same way, like lightning had struck it. Jess sat down hard on a rock and started crying quietly. She kept saying, "We're not supposed to be here." I tried to calm her, said we just needed to keep heading downhill until we hit the road. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach turn. The prints behind us, not ours. Bare footprints in the dust. Human-sized but wrong somehow, the toes too long, the heel too deep. They weren't there before. I told her not to look and we picked up the pace. The trail ahead twisted right again, looping back toward a ridge we hadn't seen earlier. Every time we blinked, the angle of the switchbacks changed slightly, like the mountain was breathing. Once I swore the ground dipped under my foot, like stepping onto a moving surface. The horizon swam for a second before settling. Jess started muttering under her breath, counting steps. It was something she did when she was scared. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Her voice steadied her, but it unnerved me. Each time she reached 10, I'd glance back and the trail would have changed direction again. We finally saw a figure ahead near a cluster of rocks. A man standing still, facing the canyon. He was wearing a white shirt, stained with something brown along the back. I called out, but he didn't move. Jess didn't want to go near him, but there was nowhere else to go. When we got within 30 feet, the figure turned slightly, enough for me to see his profile. His face looked carved from stone, dry and gray, like it had been left in the sun too long. His eyes weren't eyes, just hollow sockets filled with dust. Then he took a step forward and the trail bent sharply beneath him. Swallowing his legs as if the ground was liquid, he vanished, leaving only the echo of those crunching footsteps. We ran then, ignoring the GPS, ignoring everything. The air felt thicker, the light dimmer even though the sun still hung above us. It was like running through water. I could feel the pull of the mountain, every breath burning in my chest. Jess fell once, scraped her hands bloody, but we didn't stop. The trail behind us kept moving, reshaping itself into patterns that made no sense. Loops, switchbacks that led into each other, paths that vanished mid-step. I swear at one point we saw our own footprints ahead of us, as if we'd circled back without realizing. When we finally saw the parking lot below, it looked wrong too. Smaller, farther away than it should have been. But the fear of staying up there was stronger than the fear of falling. So we kept going. We stumbled out of the brush sometime after dark, covered in dust, shaking uncontrollably. The car was right where we left it, except for one thing. There were footprints leading up to the driver's side door. The same long-toed, deep-heeled prints we'd seen on the trail. We drove straight out of the park that night. Didn't stop until we hit Alpine. Jess refused to talk the whole way, just stared out the window. When we finally got cell service, my phone showed the hike recorded as 1.8 miles total. Not even halfway up. No loops, no detours. Just a single straight line that ended abruptly in the middle of the map. I still have that screenshot. Every time I zoom in, the path looks a little different, like it's drawing itself again. A few months later, I read an old forum post from a retired ranger who'd worked Big Bend in the 70s. He mentioned the Lost Mine Trail briefly. Said the local Apache once believed the mountains could shift to hide sacred places. They called certain paths living trails, roads that remember who walks them. Jess doesn't hike anymore, neither do I. But sometimes late at night I'll wake up and hear the sound of gravel shifting somewhere outside, like footsteps circling the house. It always stops when I look out the window. But in the morning, the dust by my truck has faint marks, prints with long, deep heels leading toward the edge of the yard, always pointing west, toward Big Bend. When I first signed up for volunteer duty at the fire lookout in the Davis Mountains, it was supposed to be a quiet way to clear my head. I had just retired from teaching high school science, and after 30 years of stale hallways and fluorescent lights, the idea of sitting alone above the desert, watching storms roll in from Mexico sounded almost holy. The tower sat on Pine Peak, 30 miles from the nearest town, a wooden skeleton built during the 1930s by the Civilian Conservation Corps. It still creaked like it remembered those men. My shifts were usually 2 weeks at a time, though toward the end I began taking shorter stints, just enough to keep my name on the list. The ranger station paid little, but I didn't need much. The isolation was the real payment. I thought I knew loneliness before that place, but real solitude has a texture, a taste almost. Dry air, creosote, static. By the time of my last shift, the Davis Mountains had become the only place that felt like home. It was October, just before the first cold fronts sweep across West Texas. The desert smelled different then, metallic and sharp, like rain was thinking about falling but hadn't made up its mind yet. I drove my old Tacoma up the long dirt track that led to Pine Peak, the truck bed loaded with supplies, water jugs, canned beans, instant coffee, and a small propane heater. The Park Service radio crackled every few miles, mostly static with a few check-ins from rangers stationed down at the Olympia Crossing base. They knew it was my last shift. Some of them made jokes about me finally getting a taste of civilization again. I didn't tell them I wasn't sure I wanted it. The tower rose like a ghost against the sky when I reached the ridge. From the base, the world stretched out in layers of color. Burnt red rock, gray sagebrush, black volcanic cliffs fading into pale blue distance. The stairs groaned under my boots as I climbed, each step flexing under weight that had been placed there 1,000 times before. Inside, the cabin smelled like dust and smoke. I opened the shutters one by one, letting the light flood in. The old binoculars sat on the counter next to the fire map. I ran my fingers over the notches scratched into the wood beside them. Every lookout carved their initials there when they finished their final shift. There were dozens of names, some so faded you could only see them if you tilted your head toward the light. I traced the most recent one, C. Reyes 2017. I never met her, but I'd seen her notes in the logbook. Neat handwriting, careful observations, no nonsense. The last entry in her section read, Smoke East Ridge resolved. Heard movement below tower, probably elk. That was the year before I started volunteering. The first few hours passed as they usually did. I scanned the ridgelines for smoke plumes, checked wind direction, noted cloud cover, and scribbled everything into the logbook. The air stayed still until late afternoon, when thunder began to rumble behind the Guadalupe Range. A dry storm, no rain, just lightning and dust. Those were the dangerous ones. I watched for sparks among the trees, small curls of gray that might turn into disaster. Nothing appeared. By dusk, the horizon burned orange, then cooled to violet. I heated a can of chili, ate it straight from the tin, and sat on the cot with my thermos. The tower swayed slightly in the wind. That motion always unsettled me at first, but after enough nights you learn to trust the wood. It creaks, but it holds. It wasn't until full dark that the feeling started. The sense of being observed. Not in the paranoid way you might feel when camping alone, but sharper, heavier, like a presence you could measure by weight. I had felt something similar before once or twice, but I always blamed it on exhaustion or the wind. Tonight it pressed harder. The window glass reflected the room back at me. My own figure lit by the lantern, a pale shape surrounded by darkness. Then behind that reflection, I thought I saw movement. Not distinct, just a shift of darker against dark. I turned off the lantern and waited. My eyes adjusted slowly until the desert returned, painted silver by moonlight. The rocks, the trees, the faint outlines of switchback trails below. Everything still. I told myself it was nothing and turned the light back on. Around midnight, I went out onto the catwalk to stretch. The stars looked close enough to touch. You don't realize how bright they can get until you're 50 miles from the nearest electric light. That's when I heard it. A metallic clank below, like something brushing against the ladder. I leaned over the railing, peering down. The wind rustled through the junipers, but nothing moved. I called out, "Who's there?" My voice sounded too loud. It carried down the mountain and vanished. No answer came back. I stayed out there for a while longer, listening. Once I thought I heard a slow, measured exhale. It might have been the wind, or it might have been something else entirely. The next morning, I found footprints in the dust around the tower's base. Boot prints, large, deep, circling the structure twice before heading into the brush. I radioed it in, but the signal crackled and died halfway through my message. I logged it in the book and told myself I'd mention it when I signed out the next day. But that night, the footsteps returned. I heard them around 2 a.m., moving slow, deliberate, stopping now and then like whoever it was kept looking up. The sound circled once, twice, then stopped directly beneath the hatch ladder. I stood frozen at the top of it, flashlight in one hand, pistol in the other. I don't like guns, but the rangers insisted I carry one after a mountain lion was spotted near the ridge last spring. I aimed the light downward through the hatch gap. The beam caught the top few rungs, then darkness. No eyeshine, no shape, nothing. The steps started again, retreating toward the east slope. I didn't sleep at all after that. The following day, I hiked down halfway to check the nearest trail camera. It hung from a post overlooking the access path, motion sensor still blinking. I pulled the memory card and slid it into my pocket. When I checked the footage later on my laptop, most clips were the usual. Deer, a stray coyote, wind shaking branches. But at 1:47 a.m., one frame froze me. A man stood halfway up the slope facing the tower. He wore a dark jacket and a wide-brimmed hat, his face hidden in shadow. He didn't move for almost 2 minutes, just stood there looking up, hands at his sides. Then he stepped backward and disappeared into the brush. I replayed it several times, trying to catch details, but each time my chest tightened the same way. I thought about hiking out early, but pride kept me. It was my last shift. I didn't want to end it as the guy who spooked himself and ran. That evening, the air went still, heavy before a storm. I sat with the radio beside me, waiting for check-in time. Static hissed, then a voice came through, thin, distant. "Base to Pine Peak, copy?" I pressed the button. "This is Pine Peak, I copy." Silence followed. I thought the signal had dropped, then the same voice came back, slower now. "You're not supposed to be there tonight." My hand froze. "Say again?" I asked. Nothing. The channel filled with static again, no response. I switched to the backup frequency, called 3 times. No answer. I decided to close the shutters and stay inside until daylight. It must have been past midnight when I heard the first knock, gentle on the trapdoor below the hatch. Once, twice, then silence. I stood by the desk, staring at the floorboards. The air had gone cold. A faint smell rose, smoke like distant campfire ash. I whispered, "Who's up here?" The knock came again, louder this time. I aimed my flashlight at the hatch. The metal latch trembled once. Then a voice called up, low and hoarse. "You left the light on." I felt something twist in my gut. I hadn't said that phrase to anyone, but I'd written it 2 months ago in the logbook after a late-night storm, when lightning hit a ridge and I'd left the beacon on longer than protocol allowed. Light left on. Might have been seen from the basin. I'd written it in my own handwriting. Whoever was down there had read it. The latch clicked open. I kicked it shut, threw the bolt, and backed away. For hours, nothing else happened. When dawn finally came, I forced myself to check outside. The trapdoor hung slightly ajar, the hinge screw stripped. Below, the footprints led away again, but now there were 2 sets. One older, half erased by wind, and another fresh. The older ones matched the first night's pattern exactly, down to the stride and depth. The newer ones overlapped them perfectly, as if whoever made them had been tracing the same path again and again. I finished the shift early, packed my gear, and descended the tower for what I swore would be the last time. The whole way down I felt eyes on me, the same cold weight as before. When I reached the truck, I glanced back once. On the catwalk, a figure stood just inside the railing, watching. Same hat, same stillness. The sun behind him made it impossible to see his face. I drove faster than I should have down that mountain road. When I signed out at the station, the ranger on duty looked confused. "We didn't have anyone scheduled up there last night," he said. I told him it must have been a mix-up, showed him the logbook. But when he flipped to the last pages, my entry for that shift was already written. dated the same day, same time in my handwriting. Only at the end there was one line I hadn't written. It said, "He's leaving tonight. I'll take the watch." I never went back. But sometimes when storms roll across the desert and I see the lightning flicker on the horizon, I imagine that tower silhouetted against the sky, shutters open, beacon glowing faintly through the rain. And I wonder if someone's still up there standing where I once stood, watching the world the same way I did. Except now maybe, they're watching me. I never believed in the stories about Possum Kingdom Lake. I grew up hearing the usual ones, fishermen seeing strange lights, families vanishing from their campsites, whispers across the water late at night. But I always thought it was just the kind of stuff people made up to make their weekend trip more exciting. It's the kind of lake that carries silence like a secret. The hills around it block the wind and the water at night turns black, mirror smooth, so still that sound feels like it just dies before it can travel. You can stand on the bank and shout your name and it'll feel like the water swallowed it whole. There were 4 of us that weekend. Me, my girlfriend Emma, her brother Kyle, and his friend Lauren. We were camping on the north side, not far from a spot called Hell's Gate. It was late September, that perfect in-between season when the nights get cool enough for a fire, but the days still hold some heat. We picked a spot right on the edge of the lake about 50 feet from the water line. Kyle brought his dad's old fishing boat and Emma packed enough food for 3 days. That first night was normal. We drank, laughed, told stories. Around midnight, we sat by the fire and looked out at the water. The moon was high, almost full, and the surface looked like glass with ribbons of silver light. I remember saying how beautiful it looked, how quiet. And that's when Emma asked if anyone else saw the stars moving. At first, I didn't see what she meant. Then I noticed it. 3 faint lights like dim yellow orbs, hovering just above the water far out in the cove. They weren't stars. They were too low, and they were moving slow and deliberate like someone waving lanterns back and forth in the dark. Kyle thought it might be boaters, maybe someone out late. But they didn't move like flashlights or headlamps. They didn't bob with the water or drift with the current. They just floated, silent, gliding in a pattern that didn't make sense. Lauren said, "That's weird as hell. Why aren't they making any sound?" She was right. No motor, no splashing, nothing. Just those 3 orbs hanging above the surface. Emma pulled out her phone and started recording. We all did. I zoomed in as much as my camera would let me, but the lights blurred and smeared no matter how steady I held it. After a few minutes, they flickered once, twice, and vanished, gone, like someone flipped a switch. We joked about it for a while. Kyle said maybe it was swamp gas or drones, but there aren't any swampy areas near that part of the lake and drones don't move like that. We eventually went to sleep, though I kept thinking about those lights. I remember hearing small ripples on the shore sometime in the night, like something brushing the rocks, but I didn't get up. The next morning, we woke to sunlight pouring through the tents. Emma was making coffee when Kyle came over holding his phone. "You guys need to see this," he said. He'd opened his camera roll. There was a video there, time-stamped around 2:13 a.m., 2 hours after we'd gone to sleep. The video showed our camp from about 20 feet out on the water. The angle was impossible. You could see us sleeping in the tents, the fire just embers now, smoke drifting upward. The sound was strange, muffled and static-heavy like it was recorded inside a hollow pipe. At the 15-second mark, something moved across the screen. A faint glow, the same yellowish light we'd seen over the lake. It passed close to the camera, and for a split second, it illuminated something that looked like a figure standing on the shore near the tents. Not one of us, taller. Its arms hung too long, its head tilted slightly as if watching. Then the light passed and the video ended. We checked all our phones. Every single one had the same video. Same angle, same timestamp, same static noise. None of us had taken it. Lauren thought it had to be a prank, maybe a hacker or some Bluetooth glitch, but there was no signal out there. I turned my phone off immediately. Emma was pale, staring across the water. She whispered, "It was right there. It was standing right where you parked the boat." We tried to brush it off again, telling ourselves maybe it was a bad dream or a trick of light, but nobody really believed that. Kyle wanted to leave right then, but Emma said she wanted to stay one more night. She needed to see if it happened again. I didn't want to, but the idea of leaving her out there alone wasn't an option. That night, we built another fire. The wind had died down, and the lake was even calmer than before. Around midnight, the lights came back. This time there were more, 5 or 6 of them scattered across the water, all moving in slow, perfect unison. No sound, no reflection, just glowing balls gliding over the surface like they were alive. Emma whispered, "Do you see that? They're closer." They were, much closer, maybe 100 yards out. Then the nearest one stopped and hovered directly across from our camp. Kyle stood up and shouted, "Hey! Whoever's out there, knock it off." Nothing, the light didn't move. It just hung there, pulsing softly like it was breathing. Lauren grabbed my arm. "Look at your phone," she said. All of our phones had turned on, screens glowing in sync. The same video was playing again, only this time it was live. It showed us right there by the fire, looking out at the water. I could see myself, my face pale and reflected in the screen, and behind me, in the video, the light hovered closer. Then, in the video, something began to rise from the water. Not a person, not even a shape you could name. Just a silhouette of something impossibly thin, like a shadow with depth, dripping as it pulled itself upward. Emma screamed and threw her phone into the lake. Kyle grabbed the cooler and started kicking dirt over the fire. I remember him yelling, "Get in the boat!" Now we ran. The lights followed. I don't mean they moved after us, they moved with us, like they knew exactly where we'd go. As we pushed off, I looked back and saw the one on shore brighten, stretching into a column of light that reached from the ground to the sky. Inside it, something was moving. I couldn't see it clearly, but it looked like dozens of faces twisting and turning as if trapped behind glass. The boat engine sputtered to life, and we sped toward the middle of the lake. The lights didn't chase us anymore. They just drifted behind, hovering low over the water, watching. We made it to the marina at sunrise, shaking and soaked. Kyle called the sheriff's department, but they didn't send anyone. The deputy on the line just said, "We get a lot of calls like that out there," and hung up. When we got home, Emma wouldn't speak for days. Kyle deleted every photo and video from his phone, but it didn't matter. The footage came back every time. He'd delete it, empty the trash, even reset the phone, and still the file would reappear. Same timestamp, same view of the camp. I broke up with Emma a month later. She started waking up at night saying she saw reflections of light in the mirror. She covered her windows with blankets. Kyle moved out of town, that was 2 years ago. Last night I got a notification on my phone while I was driving home. It said new video saved. I opened it and there it was. The same scene. The same angle. The same lake. Only this time the light wasn't over the water. It was in my living room window. I don't care if anyone believes me. What happened out on Caddo Lake last spring is burned into my mind in a way that no camera could ever capture. I've tried deleting the footage a dozen times, but it always finds its way back. Sometimes it just reappears in my GoPro folder. Once it showed up on my phone, even though I never transferred it there. But before I get to that, you need to understand what that place feels like when you're out there alone. Caddo Lake sits between Texas and Louisiana, a tangle of dark water, moss-choked cypress trees, and low mist that never seems to lift. The locals treat it with a strange mix of pride and fear. They call it beautiful in the daytime, but they'll also warn you not to go paddling after dusk. I used to think that was just small-town superstition, something to spook tourists. I was wrong. I'd driven out from Marshall early one Saturday morning, GoPro strapped to the bow of my kayak, planning to film a sunrise trip for my nature channel. The idea was simple. Catch that golden light streaming through the hanging moss, record the wildlife waking up, maybe get a few drone shots later. The air was thick with humidity, still cool but heavy, and everything was quiet except for the slow slap of water against the hull. I drifted past the cypress knees that rose like claws from the black water, their roots twisting under the surface. There was this strange rhythm to the lake, a kind of pulse you could almost feel through the paddle. It wasn't wind or current. It was like the whole swamp was breathing. I'd been out there maybe half an hour when I noticed her. At first, it didn't even register as something strange. About 50 yards ahead, where the mist hung thickest, there was a white shape moving smoothly across the water. I figured it was just another kayaker or maybe someone in a canoe. But as I drew closer, I saw she wasn't in a boat. She was standing. The woman wore a long white dress that drifted around her legs like fog. Her hair hung wet and dark against her shoulders. She didn't make a ripple, not even when she seemed to glide over open water. I slowed my paddle, my first instinct being to call out, but something in the back of my mind told me not to. Instead, I adjusted the GoPro angle to keep her centered in frame. When I replayed the footage later, I saw something I hadn't noticed in the moment. Her reflection in the water didn't match her movements. While she glided forward, the reflection turned its head, slowly, deliberately, until it was staring straight into the lens. But out there, all I saw was her face beginning to lift, pale and distant through the mist. She looked up toward me, and for a second I thought she was smiling, but it wasn't that. Her lips were moving like she was whispering something. I couldn't hear her over the soft creak of the kayak, but I swear it was my name. I backed up a little, the paddle trembling in my hands, but the water barely moved. She didn't sink or wade closer. She just stayed there, mouth still forming silent words. And then the fog shifted and she was gone. One blink and she vanished, leaving only a widening ring on the water's surface. When I checked the footage that evening, I nearly dropped my laptop. Every time she mouthed a word, the GoPro's mic spiked with static. It wasn't random noise either. It rose and fell like a human voice buried under distortion. I spent hours trying to clean the audio, and underneath the crackle I could just make out a few words. Stay out. The next morning, I went back. I told myself it was for proof, that I'd film again and find a logical explanation. I launched at the same spot, the same time, and followed the same route. Everything looked normal until I reached that clearing again. This time the air smelled sour like algae and rot, and there were bubbles rising from beneath the surface. I kept the camera rolling, heart hammering as I leaned forward to look closer. That's when something bumped the bottom of the kayak. Hard. It wasn't a log or a fish. It was deliberate. A second later, another hit. This one from the side, spinning me halfway around. I looked down into the water and saw movement. Something pale and twisting beneath the surface, like fabric unfurling in slow motion. I paddled back, trying not to tip over, but the lake seemed to thicken around me, dragging at the hull. And then right beside me, a face broke the surface. It was her. The same woman, but closer now, eyes wide and colorless. She wasn't gasping or moving. She just stared up at me, her mouth still forming those same silent words. I could see her hands just below the surface, fingers splayed open as if pressing against glass. The reflection in the water wasn't her this time, it was me. My reflection staring down at her, except the face wasn't matching mine. It was grinning. I panicked and swung the paddle hard. The blade hit nothing, but the sound it made was like striking flesh. The ripples spread and she sank straight down, the water swallowing her without a trace. I didn't stop paddling until I reached the shore. I left the kayak tied to a tree and drove home without looking back. The camera was still rolling when I pulled it off the bow. Later that night, when I played the footage, the timestamp jumped halfway through the recording. Between two frames, it cut from open water to a new angle, low, as if the camera was resting on the lake surface itself. You can see me in the distance paddling away fast, and behind me, her face rises once more just beneath the lens. This time her eyes move, tracking me as I go. I shut the laptop. I didn't sleep that night. 2 days later, I tried to delete the files. The folder froze every time I selected it. I reformatted the SD card, and the moment I plugged it back in, the folder reappeared. I threw the GoPro in the trash, but when I opened my phone gallery the next morning, the thumbnail was there again. A single still frame from the footage. Me paddling, her in the distance, and her reflection looking straight into the lens. That was months ago. I moved out of Marshall after that. Rented a small place up near Tyler, nowhere near the water. I don't go kayaking anymore. But at night, when the room gets quiet, I can still hear it. That slow slap of water against the hull, the faint hiss of static building behind my ears, and a woman's voice whispering my name through the dark. Last week, I got a package with no return label. Inside was a memory card. I shouldn't have checked, but curiosity always wins. There was only one file on it, footage from a GoPro dated that same weekend at Caddo Lake. The first few minutes were calm, just trees and water and morning mist. Then the camera dips low like it's sinking, and for a few seconds there's nothing but murk, and then she appears again, rising out of the water, pale face framed in the moss. But this time she's holding something. It's my kayak paddle, and as she moves closer to the camera, the reflection shows something that turns my stomach every time I see it. The reflection isn't her anymore. It's me, standing on the surface of the lake beside her, watching and smiling back. I never believed in haunted machines until that night. It was one of those heavy, still Texas nights in late August, when the air feels thick enough to chew and every sound carries for miles. I had fallen asleep on the couch with the TV playing one of those late-night infomercials, half dreaming about nothing in particular when I heard it. A lawnmower running somewhere outside. The sound was unmistakable, that steady metallic whine, the uneven rhythm of the blade catching something in the grass, sputtering for a beat, then humming back into its groove. It made no sense. It was 2 a.m. I remember sitting up slowly, blinking in confusion, thinking maybe one of the neighbors had lost their mind or decided to mow by flashlight. But our nearest neighbor was a good half-acre away, and the sound wasn't coming from down the road. It was coming from my yard. At first, I just listened, waiting for it to stop. Maybe someone was stealing it, I thought. But then I realized it wasn't moving much. The sound kept coming from the same spot, near the back fence where I always parked my old push mower under the oak tree. I killed the TV, stood up, and just stood there in the silence that followed, except for that distant growl of the motor. My house sat at the edge of town near a patch of dry field that used to be farmland before they sold it for housing. No streetlights back there, just the faint silver wash of moonlight through the windows. When I pulled the curtain aside, I could see it clearly enough. The mower was running, just sitting there, blades turning, like someone had yanked the cord and left it, only no one was there. For a long minute, I thought maybe I was still dreaming. But then I saw the grass moving around it, shredded in fresh arcs like it had just been pushed a few feet. I grabbed my phone, switched on the flashlight, and opened the back door. The second I stepped outside, the smell hit me. That mix of gasoline and wet grass that usually means you've just cut the yard. Except the air was too still, the grass damp with dew, and the sound seemed louder, meaner somehow. I remember walking down the steps telling myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe it slipped into gear on its own. Maybe some raccoon brushed against the handle. I was running through every logical excuse I could think of, but none of them fit. My mower wasn't one of those self-propelled ones. You had to hold the handle tight, squeeze the lever, and push it forward. If you let go, it stopped. That was the safety design. But the blades were turning. The engine was roaring like it was being guided by an invisible hand. I got about 10 feet away before I stopped. My flashlight beam cut across the yard, the wet grass glistening like a sea of silver blades. The mower sat near the fence, rocking just slightly, handle bobbing as if someone were holding it loosely. My breath came out short, ragged. I could see the shape of my shadow stretching across the grass, but nothing else. No footprints near it, no movement. I shouted, "Who's out there?" My voice sounded thin. The mower didn't stop. It just shifted a little, like it was turning toward me. The blades made that metallic ring when they clipped a piece of gravel, and something about that sharp note made my stomach drop. I started backing away, thinking I should go inside, grab something, call the cops, anything. But before I could move another step, the mower stopped dead. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It wasn't just quiet, it was absolute. Even the crickets had gone still. I waited, my ears straining for some sign, but there was nothing. Then without warning, the mower started again. This time, the pull wasn't gentle. It jerked forward with a violent lurch, blades screaming, shooting wet grass in every direction. I stumbled back as it surged a few feet, turned sharply, and stopped again. It was like it was searching. My flashlight beam shook in my hand. I could see the handle vibrating as if someone invisible had their fingers wrapped around it. The air felt wrong, heavy with something I couldn't name, like standing next to a live wire. I remember yelling again, but it came out half-choked. The mower sat there for maybe 5 seconds, motionless, before it started rolling. Not fast, not slow, just steady. Straight toward me, I bolted. My feet slid in the damp grass, and I hit the porch steps hard enough to bruise my shin. I turned and saw it coming, the front wheels bouncing slightly as it chewed a narrow line through the yard. I ran inside and slammed the door, heart hammering so loud I could barely hear myself breathe. Through the small window above the sink, I watched the mower come to a stop at the base of the steps. It idled there, blades spinning, humming like some patient animal waiting to be let in. After a minute or two, I gathered enough courage to grab my phone and record. The light from the window caught the top of the mower, gleaming faintly. It wasn't moving anymore, just sitting there in the dark, engine rumbling like a steady heartbeat. I called the sheriff's office, but by the time the deputy pulled up 15 minutes later, The mower was silent. When we went out together, it was exactly where I'd left it, handle up, blade stopped, cool to the touch. The deputy looked at me like I was nuts, said maybe I'd heard something from down the road or a prank. But I showed him the video, and I swear the color drained from his face. You could see it in the footage clear as day. The mower sitting still 1 second, then suddenly jerking to life without anyone near it. He told me to keep it inside the shed and lock it just in case. I did exactly that. The next morning, I drained the gas and pulled the spark plug, figuring that would be the end of it. But that night, around the same hour, I woke to the same sound. Not the mower itself. It was the faint hum of the engine coming through the wall, like it was running somewhere far away but near enough to feel. I went out again, heart pounding, flashlight shaking. The shed door was still locked, my padlock solid, but I could see light flickering through the cracks in the wood. When I got closer, I realized it wasn't light, it was sparks. The blade was turning inside even without fuel, scraping against the concrete floor. I remember whispering, "No," like saying it would make it stop. But it didn't. The sound grew louder, faster, and then the entire shed shook once, hard enough to rattle the hinges. I stumbled back, fell in the dirt, and when I looked up again, everything was dark. No sound, no movement. The air was thick with that smell again. Gas, oil, wet grass, and something else. Something metallic, almost like blood. I didn't go back to the shed until daylight. When I finally did, the mower was there, right where I'd left it, but the floor beneath it was torn up. Deep grooves carved into the concrete like claw marks. The blade was bent. The metal shroud dented inward, like something had hit it from underneath. I tried selling it the next day, but no one wanted it. A guy from town came to look and said he felt dizzy standing near it. Said it gave him a headache. I ended up hauling it to the dump myself. Even then, as I drove, I could swear I heard it rattling in the back of the truck, faintly humming in rhythm with the road. I dumped it off near the scrap pile and didn't look back. For weeks after, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear the sound again, that whine in the distance, faint but steady. Sometimes in the early hours, I'd think I could see a thin line of freshly cut grass leading up to my back porch, even when I hadn't mowed in days. Then one night, the power went out during a storm. I lit a candle and tried to sit it out. But the wind was screaming against the house, rain pounding the windows. When the lightning flashed, I looked outside and for a split second I saw it. Out there in the yard. The mower, slick with rain, handle upright, engine quiet but waiting. I blinked and it was gone. Just darkness again. But when I went out the next morning, the grass was cut in perfect lines. I haven't owned a mower since. I pay a guy from town to handle it now. I never told him why, but I can always tell when he's done because he never stays long. He cuts quick, packs up fast, and leaves without looking back. Sometimes late at night, I'll wake up to silence so thick it feels wrong, and I'll swear I can smell gas. And once, about a month ago, I heard it again. That faint, distant hum like a mower running somewhere it shouldn't be. I stood at the window, not daring to move, listening as it faded away into the dark just like before. I keep telling myself machines can't remember, can't hold on to anything. But when I see the perfect lines in my grass every morning, even when no one's been out there, I start to wonder if maybe some things don't need hands to keep working. Maybe they just need a reason. I never used to believe that the dead needed tending to. My wife Margaret did. She was a quiet woman, steady in her ways, and she believed cemeteries were living places. You don't just bury them and forget, she'd say. You keep them company. When she died last winter, I took her job as caretaker at Willow Bend Cemetery in Gonzales County, mostly to keep myself busy, but also to stay close to her. The cemetery sits at the edge of town, between a stretch of pecan trees and a dried-up creek bed that only fills when the rains come. It's old, some stones so weathered you can't read the names anymore, others chipped by decades of wind and heat. The grass grows thick in summer, brittle in winter, and the iron gate groans like it's been crying for oil since the war. I started every morning at dawn, checking the grounds, clearing leaves, trimming the edges near the newer graves. I liked the quiet of it, no one to talk to, no noise but the birds and the soft scrape of my rake. It wasn't until March that I started noticing the flowers. The first bouquet appeared on a grave near the back corner, where the older headstones lean into each other like drunks. The name was Lillian Pruitt, died 1949. Nobody had come to see her since I'd been there. Yet there, resting neatly against her stone, were fresh-cut daisies tied with twine. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe a descendant had visited while I was at lunch, or maybe a kind stranger left them as a gesture. But the next morning there was another bouquet, this time on Johnny McClure, 1923 to 1951, and another the day after that, on a headstone so faded I couldn't make out a single letter. Each one the same, fresh daisies tied with the same rough twine. They weren't store-bought. These were hand-picked, stems uneven, petals bruised in spots like they'd been gathered from a field. It was odd, but the kind of odd you let pass when you work around the dead. Still, by the end of the week, I couldn't ignore it. The flowers kept appearing. Always before sunrise, always on graves belonging to people I knew had no family left. I'd checked the cemetery registry. No visitors had signed in. No cars had passed through the gate on the cameras I'd installed. It bothered me more than it should have. Margaret used to keep a small garden of wild daisies behind our house. She said they reminded her of spring when she was a girl. When I buried her, I placed a bouquet just like those on her headstone, tied with twine from her kitchen drawer. One morning I was walking the eastern row when I saw something that stopped me cold. A new bouquet sat on Lillian Pruitt's grave, but this one had a faint smudge of red along one of the stems. I leaned closer. It wasn't dirt. It was dried blood like from a thumb nicked on a thorn. I turned slowly and looked around. No one was there. The fog was thick that morning, clinging low to the grass. I thought I heard the sound of footsteps crunching gravel near the fence, but when I followed the noise, it stopped. Later that day, I checked Margaret's grave. Her daisies had wilted to a dull yellow, but something was off. There were fewer than before. I counted 7. I'd placed 12. The next morning, there were only 6. That was when the connection hit me. Each time a new bouquet appeared on another grave, one from hers went missing. I felt a deep chill that didn't come from the cold. I told myself someone was stealing them. Kids, maybe. Teenagers playing ghost games. But the more I watched, the more deliberate it felt. Whoever or whatever it was, they were taking exactly one flower each time. I decided to stay late that night. I brought a thermos of coffee, my flashlight, and my old rifle just in case. I parked my truck near the caretaker's shed and waited. Around midnight, the air grew still. No crickets, no wind, not even the rustle of the pecan trees. I sat by the window sipping coffee when I heard it. A soft click of the gate latch. I turned off my light and peered through the glass. Someone was walking among the graves, slow and steady. I couldn't make out a face, but the shape was familiar. They were carrying something, a bundle of white blooms. My throat went dry. I stepped out quietly, the gravel crunching under my boots. "Hey!" I called out. The figure froze. Then it turned toward me. Even in the moonlight, I could see it wasn't some kid. The face was pale, sunken, and the hair fell in thin strands over hollow eyes. But what made my knees weaken was the way she held the flowers. By the stems, just like Margaret used to, with her thumb resting over the twine. She didn't run. She didn't speak. She just looked at me for a long time, her expression blank but somehow sad. Then she began placing daisies one by one on the nearest grave, the way Margaret always did, kneeling, smoothing the grass, whispering something under her breath. "Margaret?" I said. My voice broke on her name. She didn't answer. She just kept working, moving from one grave to the next, arranging flowers with careful, loving precision. When she finished, she turned and began walking toward the far end of the cemetery, where her headstone stood beneath the big live oak. I followed her, trembling. The closer I got, the colder the air felt. I swear I could see my breath hanging there, even though it was late spring. She stopped at her grave and placed the last flower, one single daisy, right at the base. Then she looked back at me. Her lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear, but I think I knew what she was saying. "Keep them company." The wind stirred then, sweeping through the grass, and for a moment she was gone. Not vanished like smoke, just gone, like she'd never been there at all. I dropped to my knees beside her headstone. The twine from the bouquet was still warm, as if it had been held in living hands. The next morning I tried to convince myself it had been a dream. But when I walked the rows, every grave that had received flowers was spotless, grass trimmed, stones cleared of moss, all perfect as if someone had tended them with care. And at the base of Margaret's grave, the twine lay neatly coiled beside a single white daisy, fresh as if picked that very morning. I don't question it anymore. I leave the gates open at night now. Every dawn I find new flowers, sometimes daisies, sometimes lilies, sometimes wild blooms I don't even recognize. Always on forgotten graves. Always tied with that same rough twine. I think she's still here, doing what she always believed in, keeping them company. And every Sunday I bring a new bouquet for her. Not because I have to, but because I know she'll share them. I never thought I'd be the kind of man to get spooked by something as simple as an echo. But that's what it started as. Just sound. A sound I couldn't explain. There were 4 of us that weekend, hunting season out near Lake Whitney. Me, my cousin Dean, our friend Russ, and Dean's younger brother Kyle. We'd rented this old fishing cabin sitting half hidden behind a patch of cedar and mesquite, maybe a mile from the waterline. It looked decent enough when we arrived. A bit crooked, sure, but solid. It smelled like cedar and dust, and when you shut the door, it made that old wood sigh like the place was exhaling for the first time in years. The owner, an old man named Dillard, had met us at the gas station to hand over the keys. He told us the cabin didn't have great reception, and the power sometimes flickered when it rained. "Keep the lanterns full," he said, "and don't go wandering off after dark. The woods play tricks out there." He said it with a half smile, like he'd said the same line to 100 tourists before. But I could tell his eyes didn't match his grin. There was something rehearsed about it. We didn't think much of it then. That first night was easy. We grilled venison, drank too much beer, and sat out on the porch listening to the coyotes howl across the lake. Around midnight we came inside, set our rifles by the wall, and started talking about stupid things. High school stories, jobs, women. Just ordinary talk. We didn't realize how much that mattered until later, when those same words came back to us in the dark. I went to sleep around 1. The others were still talking quietly when I dozed off on the couch. Sometime around 3, I woke up to the sound of whispering. It wasn't close, but it was clear. A low, hushed murmur that seemed to slide along the walls like wind through a crack. At first I thought it was Dean and Russ still up, maybe trying not to wake me, but when I sat up, I saw them both asleep in their bunks. The lantern was burning low, throwing soft light across the wood paneling, and the sound seemed to move just outside that light. I listened hard. The voices weren't foreign. That's what made it so unnerving. They were familiar in the same tone, the same rhythm. I heard my own voice or something that mimicked it, laughing quietly about something I'd said earlier. Then I heard Dean's voice, slightly off, like a recording playing through paper. "Man, I told you that dough wasn't clean," it whispered. Exactly what he'd said before bed. The words drifted around the room, soft, overlapping, as if someone outside the cabin was whispering them against the wood. I sat there for maybe 2 minutes, my heart pounding, until the sound just faded out. The woods went quiet again. I checked the porch. Nothing but fog rolling off the lake and the sound of crickets. I told myself it was the wind or maybe an animal brushing against the siding. But when I went back inside, something about the air felt wrong. Stale. Like old breath. In the morning, I told the others. They laughed, of course. Kyle said I'd probably dreamed it, and Dean cracked a joke about me hearing my conscience for once. But Russ looked uneasy. He said he'd woken up sometime before dawn and thought he heard us talking too, only we were all asleep. He said it had sounded like a radio playing in another room, but he figured it was just in his head. We shrugged it off and spent the day hunting along the ridge. Didn't catch much, just a few rabbits and a squirrel. The woods were quiet, heavier than they should have been. Even the birds seemed to stay away. When we came back that afternoon, the cabin door was slightly open. We figured one of us forgot to latch it, but when we checked inside, something felt off. Our gear was untouched, but the lantern that had been on the counter was now sitting in the middle of the table. That night, it happened again. We were sitting around the table eating beans and jerky, laughing about some dumb story Kyle told when the power blinked out. Total darkness except for the lantern's dim flame. Then from somewhere behind the walls we heard it, whispering soft but clear. It started as a low hum, like the sound of people breathing through their teeth. Then it turned into words. At first I thought it was one of the guys messing with me. The voices were ours again. The same conversation we'd had an hour earlier. Every word, every laugh, every pause. We sat frozen, listening as the whispers replayed us perfectly except slower, stretched out like the cabin itself was retelling the story in its own tongue. Russ grabbed the lantern and walked toward the back wall, the one behind the bunks. The whispers stopped as soon as he touched it. He turned to us, his face pale. "It's cold," he said. "Feel this." I put my hand on the wood. It was damp and cold, like it had just come in contact with water. We didn't sleep much after that. The air in the cabin felt thick, like every breath stirred something unseen. Around 4, we heard something tapping under the floorboards. Slow, deliberate, as if someone was knocking from underneath. None of us spoke. We just listened until it faded away. By morning, we were ready to leave. Dean said we'd pack up after breakfast, but Russ wanted to check something first. He'd been staring at the wall since dawn, mumbling about the whispers, repeating things we said. He thought maybe there was an old radio or recorder hidden somewhere. So we helped him look. Behind one of the bunks was a loose panel. Russ pried it open with a knife and a smell rolled out. Mold and rot, strong enough to make us gag. Inside the gap was something dark and soft like damp fabric. He pulled it out and dropped it on the floor. It was a leather satchel, half rotted with old hunting tags and a rusted lighter inside. And at the bottom, a strip of paper covered in faint pencil marks. It was a list of names. Dean pointed at the top. "That's the owner's name," he said. Dillard. Below it were 4 more names. Each one had a date beside it going back years. The last one stopped about 2 summers ago. That's when the whispering started again, but this time it wasn't behind the walls. It was in the room. Clear layered, like all 4 of us talking at once. The words came from the satchel, curling up out of the torn leather like breath. We heard our own voices saying the exact things we'd said since we got there. Then it moved ahead, whispering words we hadn't spoken yet. I don't know who screamed first, but we tore out of there like kids running from fire. Dean dropped his rifle. Russ tripped on the porch step. Kyle lost his hat, but none of us looked back. We didn't stop running until we hit the truck. When we drove back into town, I called Dillard. He didn't seem surprised, just sighed and said, "Should have told you boys to stay away from that wall." I demanded to know what he meant, but he hung up. A week later, I found a newspaper clipping about a missing group of hunters near Lake Whitney from 1998. Their names matched the list we'd found. I tried calling Dillard again, but the number was disconnected. Sometimes when I'm half asleep, I still hear it. The same words we said in that cabin, whispered slow and low, like they're trapped somewhere waiting for me to answer. I'll be lying there in bed, eyes closed, and hear my own voice ask the same question I asked that night. "Did you hear that?" And every time, right after, I hear the same reply. My voice again, whispering back through the dark. "Yes." The ranch outside Junction had been empty for nearly 2 years before Sheriff Dan Lively got the first call. It wasn't about trespassers or kids trying to spook each other, like he half expected. It was from the new owner, a retired lineman named Arnold Clay. Arnold wasn't the kind of man who scared easy. He was big, steady, the kind who still worked his own fence posts at 63 and fixed his own truck carburetor with a cigarette between his teeth. But when he came into the sheriff's office that May morning, his hands were shaking like he'd been out in the cold. He said he'd been having problems with the sensors along his north fence line. Motion alarms kept tripping every night around 12:07, always the same time, every night for 3 weeks. At first he thought it was a coyote or a stray cow, but when he checked his cameras, he saw a figure walking the fence, back and forth, pacing slow. Sometimes it would stop, crouch, then move again. And every time Arnold went out to check, there was nothing, just footprints pressed deep into the dirt along the inside of the fence leading nowhere. Dan went out himself that afternoon. The property was old hill country land, the kind that rippled in waves of dry grass and mesquite, miles from any neighbor. The fence ran long and thin across the back pasture, barbed wire strung between cedar posts, old but strong. The cameras were new though, trail-grade, infrared, the kind deer hunters used. Arnold had lined them up every 50 yards. When Dan checked the recordings, he saw what the man was talking about. Grainy footage, black and white, time-stamped 12:07 a.m. A shape, tall and slow-moving, pacing along the inside of the wire. He couldn't make out a face, but there was something strange in the way it moved. Stiff at first, then loose, like a man who couldn't remember how to walk right. Dan scrubbed the footage frame by frame, but the figure always stopped just before the lens, turned away, then vanished into static. No clear shot, no reflection of eyes, just that crooked gait and the faint glint of barbed wire under the moon. He went out again that night, parked his cruiser on the edge of the property and waited. Around midnight, the air got still, the kind of stillness that settles heavy before a storm. The crickets went quiet and the wind dropped out of the trees like someone had flipped a switch. At 12:07, the radio on his shoulder crackled with a burst of static. Then came the sound of boots scraping gravel somewhere out past the headlights. Slow, steady, measured steps. Dan got out, flashlight in hand, and called out, "This is Sheriff Lively. You're trespassing. Come on out now." No answer. The sound stopped. He swept the beam along the fence line and saw it. Just a shadow between the posts, tall and narrow like a man in an old coat. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there as if waiting. When Dan took a few steps closer, the light blinked against the barbed wire and the shape seemed to sink back into the dark, melting into the tall grass. He crossed the fence and followed, but there was nothing there. Only footprints, bare feet deep and angled inward, all facing the wrong direction. Not leading away from the fence, but toward the ranch house. Arnold was waiting on the porch when Dan came back. He looked worse than before, his eyes bloodshot, a shotgun across his knees. He said it had been happening longer than he first admitted. The motion sensors had been tripping before he even installed the cameras. At first he thought it was the wind shaking the posts, but one night he'd gone out with a flashlight and seen a figure just beyond the fence, walking the line like it was patrolling. When he yelled at it, it stopped, turned, and started walking toward him. He'd backed up to the porch, tripped, dropped the light. When he picked it up again, there was no one there. The next morning, he found prints all around the house, everyone pointing inward. Dan told him to keep the lights on that night and not go outside. He promised he'd drive by again before dawn. But around 2:30 a.m., dispatch got another call. Same address. No voice on the line, just a faint scratching sound and what might have been whispering. By the time Dan arrived, the porch light was still on, but the front door hung open. The living room was empty except for the shotgun leaning against the wall and a coffee mug spilled across the table. The back door was locked from the inside. The only sign of movement was the trail of bare footprints starting at the back window and leading straight out to the fence line. They searched for 2 days with dogs, drones, and volunteers. Nothing, no body, no clothing, no sign of a struggle. The footprints just stopped halfway across the pasture, as if whoever made them had stepped off the earth. Dan reviewed every minute of camera footage, but all the recordings between midnight and 1 a.m. were corrupted. The files played with distorted audio, faint voices whispering low under the static, repeating a pattern that sounded almost like counting. When the ranch went up for sale again, no one touched it. Folks in town talked about the man who'd vanished, how the sheriff himself had seen the prints go inward, and how no one could explain why the cameras always failed at the same minute. A year later, the property was bought by a young couple from San Angelo looking for quiet land. They replaced the barbed wire, tore out the old cameras, and installed new motion lights. They lasted 3 weeks before calling the sheriff's office. It was the same report, lights tripping every night at exactly 12:07, always along the north fence. The husband, Mitch, told Dan that when he checked the yard one night, he saw someone walking the line, slow and deliberate. A tall man in dark clothes, head down, one arm dragging the wire as he moved. When Mitch shouted, the figure stopped and turned its head, not fast but as if curious. He said he could feel something pressing against his chest, like being watched from the inside out. When he blinked, the figure was gone. Dan went out one last time just before dawn. He found the footprints again, clear as ever, pressed deep into the dirt. They started at the fence and led straight toward the house. He followed them, careful not to step too close, counting each print. The ground was cold, almost wet to the touch, though it hadn't rained in weeks. When he reached the porch, he stopped. The final set of prints ended right at the threshold, as if the man had stepped up into the house. But the door was closed, locked from inside. Dan knocked, called out, waited, no answer. The lights were off now, the windows dark. He circled back and saw something that stopped him cold. Along the fence, every post had been marked with a single slash, carved fresh into the wood, each one angled the same way, each one glistening with a faint, dark stain that wasn't sap. By sunrise, the house was empty again. The couple's truck was still in the drive, keys in the ignition, engine cold. No sign of a struggle, no blood, no note, just footprints leading inward. When Dan replayed the security feed from the front porch camera, the file began normally, showing the couple stepping outside around midnight to check the lights. Then the image blurred, lines of static cutting through the screen. For one frame, just one, there was a clear shot of the yard. The man was standing at the fence line facing the camera. His features were faint, but his eyes shone white against the dark, and behind him, stretched across the wire, were shapes. Dozens of them. all facing inward. After that, Dan retired early, moved down to Careville, bought a small place off the highway, and never took another call after midnight. But sometimes when he couldn't sleep, he'd think about that time on the ranch. The stillness, the silence, the way the prints never went out, only in, and he'd remember what the old locals used to say about that land long before it was fenced. How the Comanche trails ran through there. Paths the spirits were said to walk after dark, always circling, never crossing back. They believed the dead walked their borders forever, guarding what was taken from them. Dan never believed that stuff before. But now, every so often, he wakes in the middle of the night, looks out his window at the line of oaks beyond his yard and swears he can see someone out there, pacing slow and steady, just on the edge of the light. A few miles outside Fredericksburg, along the stretch of road that winds past Enchanted Rock, the air always feels heavier at night. The granite dome looms like a sleeping giant, its surface catching the faint glow of headlights as if remembering some older light. Drivers talk about the strange quiet out there, how their radios sometimes lose signal even when everything else works fine, how the wind seems to hum like it's whispering through hollow stone. But lately, what people talk about most is the lantern walker. It started with truckers, guys running routes between Llano and Fredericksburg used to night runs and odd sights. They'd say they saw a man walking the roadside near the Enchanted Rock turnoff, carrying an old-style lantern, the kind you'd expect to see hanging in a barn in the 1800s. The light was orange at first, dim but steady, swinging as the man moved. Some said he wore a hat, others said his head was bare and his clothes were soaked, but everyone agreed on one detail. When you got close enough for the light to shine into your windshield, he'd lift the lantern high and the flame would turn blue. The first person to mention it on the local scanner was a deputy named Travis Lowe. He was on patrol one night, around 2 a.m., when he saw the figure on the shoulder just past Ranch Road 965. He slowed down, thinking it might be someone who broke down or got lost. But when he rolled down his window to call out, the man lifted that lantern. Travis said the flame changed color in an instant, flickering from orange to bright blue like a gas stove. He blinked and the figure was gone. No sound, no shadow, no footprints when he checked the dirt the next morning. A few nights later, a couple driving home from Austin claimed they saw the same thing. The husband, a mechanic, said he thought it was a trick of the headlights, some kind of reflection off a road sign. But when they passed the spot again 10 minutes later, the figure was behind them, visible in the rearview mirror, walking the opposite way with that same lantern swinging side to side. The wife swore the flame was blue even from 100 yards back, and that it lit up the road like moonlight on water. Locals started calling it the Lantern Walker. Some said it was the ghost of an old rancher who died in a fire out near Enchanted Rock in the 1800s. Others thought it was a lost camper who'd gotten caught in a flash flood still trying to find his way home. But what made the stories more unsettling was that the sightings always happened near the same curve, the one where the guardrail still shows the scrape marks from a fatal crash in 2019. A young couple, tourists from Dallas, went over the edge one foggy night. Their car wasn't found until the next morning, half buried in cedar and rock, their phones still ringing from worried family calls. I didn't believe any of it until I saw him myself. I was coming home from a late shift at the fire station in Llano. It was early April, the kind of night where the air smells like wet dust and mesquite. The road was empty except for the hum of my engine. Around 1:30, I came around that curve and saw a faint light up ahead, like a lantern swinging low. I slowed down, thinking it might be a stranded driver. As I got closer, the beam of my headlights caught a figure standing on the shoulder. He was tall and lean, dressed in what looked like work clothes, dark pants, suspenders, a white shirt rolled up at the sleeves. His face was shadowed by the brim of a hat, and in his right hand he carried a lantern. The flame glowed soft and yellow, and for a second it looked almost ordinary. I rolled down my window to ask if he needed help, but before I could speak he raised the lantern high and the light turned a cold, bright blue. It wasn't the color that froze me. It was the way the blue light spread outward, cutting through my headlights like fog. The trees around the road looked pale, drained of color, and the air seemed to hum, low and metallic. My radio crackled even though it had been turned off. Then, as suddenly as he'd appeared, the figure vanished. The light blinked out, and I was staring at an empty patch of road. When I got home, I told my wife about it, but she brushed it off as exhaustion. Maybe it was, I thought. Maybe I'd been awake too long. But a week later, I found something that made me question everything. I'd been called out to a small brush fire off one of the backroads near Enchanted Rock. We contained it quickly, and while checking the perimeter, I found an old lantern half buried in the dirt. The glass was cracked, the handle rusted, but inside was a wick soaked in what smelled faintly like kerosene. I showed it to one of the other guys, and he joked that it must belong to the lantern walker. I laughed, but something about it felt wrong. The metal was warm, as if it had been burning just moments earlier, even though the dirt around it was damp and cool. I brought it back to the station and set it on a shelf in the storage room. That night, long after everyone had gone home, I went back to check on it. The room was dark except for the faint outline of the lantern. At first I thought I was seeing things, but then I realized the wick was glowing faintly blue, even though there was no flame. I turned on the light and the glow vanished. I left the station early that night and took the long way home, passing by the same stretch of road. It was close to midnight, the sky over Enchanted Rock washed in pale clouds. As I came around the bend, my headlights caught movement ahead. The lantern walker was there again, standing perfectly still in the middle of the road. This time, he wasn't holding the lantern. It was sitting on the ground in front of him, burning with a blue flame that didn't flicker or smoke. I stopped about 20 yards away and turned off my engine. For a long minute, neither of us moved. Then he tilted his head slightly, and I swear I saw his face for the first time. It wasn't burned or disfigured like you'd expect from a ghost story. It was calm, expressionless, but his eyes were hollow, black pits reflecting the blue light. He raised one hand and pointed toward Enchanted Rock, then back toward me. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of something sharp like ozone and whetstone. The flame dimmed, and I realized the light wasn't just blue, it was pulsing, almost breathing. Then I heard it, a voice, distant but clear, whispering my name. I turned, half expecting someone to be behind me, but there was only empty road. When I looked back, the lantern walker was gone. The next morning, I went to the ranger station and asked about old deaths or accidents near the area. The ranger, an older man who'd worked there for decades, gave me a long look before pulling out a folder. Inside were faded newspaper clippings. One was from 1934, a story about a man named Jacob Givens, a night watchman for a mining camp near Enchanted Rock. He'd gone missing after a storm, last seen carrying a lantern while searching for trapped workers. They never found his body, only the lantern floating in a flooded ravine. The article said the flame had turned blue when they picked it up. That night I drove back out there one last time, carrying the lantern I'd found. I stopped at the same curve, turned off my lights, and set the lantern on the ground. For a while, nothing happened. The night was dead quiet except for the crickets. Then the air shifted, colder, heavier. The lantern flickered once, twice, and the flame returned, bright blue, steady. A figure appeared just beyond the beam of light, walking slowly toward it. I didn't move. He stopped a few feet away, the same man as before, his face calm but unreadable. He reached out and lifted the lantern. The blue glow spread across his skin like water. Then he nodded once, almost like gratitude, and began walking toward the hills, the lantern's light fading with each step. When the flame finally went out, I realized the night had gone completely silent. Not even the insects made a sound. I left the lantern there and drove home without looking back. I've passed that road hundreds of times since then. Sometimes, in the right kind of dark, I still see a faint light moving through the brush near the base of Enchanted Rock. But it's never near the road anymore. It stays out there, deeper in the granite hills, like it's found what it was looking for. They still talk about the lantern walker, especially when the fog rolls in and headlights catch strange reflections on the rock. But I know now he isn't warning anyone. He isn't haunting the road. He's searching, still walking, still carrying that light, waiting for someone to see the blue flame and understand it means he's finally not alone. A few miles outside Lufkin, there's a stretch of road most folks don't remember anymore. County Road 4137, though no one calls it that. To the few who've driven it, it's just that back way between Dibble and some forgotten pasture land. No gas stations, no houses, just blacktop that looks too smooth for how little traffic it gets. I didn't mean to take it. I'd been on Highway 59 heading home from a late service call in Nacogdoches when the GPS lost signal, and somehow I missed the turn toward Lufkin. My phone showed a blue line rerouting me, shorter than the main highway by about 10 minutes. I figured it was fine. The evening was humid. fog rising in soft waves off the ditches, and I remember thinking how the mist looked like breath rolling from the ground. I turned right onto the county road, tires humming on the pavement, and told myself I'd be home by midnight. The first mile was uneventful. My headlights cut through the trees on both sides, pines and oaks pressing in close. The kind of dense East Texas growth that swallows sound. I cracked the window a little for air. Somewhere in the distance, a whippoorwill called, and I caught the smell of wet pine needles and old rain. It was almost peaceful. I drove slow because of the fog and because the road seemed too narrow for anyone coming the other way. My odometer ticked up steadily, 83,421 miles, then 83,422. I remember glancing at it because that number stuck in my mind later. About 6 minutes in, I noticed something strange. The road curved slightly left, then dipped through a small patch of low fog before rising again near a tall pine with a busted reflector nailed to it. A few yards after that, there was a faded sign half hidden by weeds. It said county maintenance ends. I kept going. Then maybe another minute later, I saw the same pine again. Same busted reflector, same patch of fog sitting low across the pavement. I frowned and thought maybe there was another tree that just looked like it. But then I saw the sign again too. County maintenance ends. And this time the weeds were identical down to a yellow wildflower curling around the post. I slowed down, confused. My odometer had climbed another half mile, but the world around me hadn't changed. I checked my GPS, but it was spinning, no service. I switched to offline maps and the blue line just froze. When I looked up again, the pine was back for a third time. I stopped completely this round, rolling down my window to make sure I wasn't imagining it. The night air was thick and damp, quiet enough that I could hear the ticking of my cooling engine. The fog lay still across the blacktop, and through it I saw faint skid marks on the road, curving slightly before fading out. I thought maybe I'd gotten turned around somehow, maybe looped back on a curve I hadn't noticed, though I couldn't remember any turns at all. I made a 3-point turn and headed back the way I came, feeling that first pinch of unease tighten in my stomach. The road behind me looked the same, empty, flat, lined with trees like dark walls. I kept expecting to see the junction or a farmhouse light, but there was nothing. Just the same fog, the same line of trees, the same curve. Then the pine appeared again. I braked hard, tires squealing, heart hammering against my ribs. I stared at that stupid, busted reflector. My odometer now read 83,426 miles. I had driven several miles, but somehow hadn't gone anywhere. That's when I noticed something else. The fog was thicker now, rising higher, almost up to the hood. The trees beyond the ditch looked wrong, slightly darker, their shapes blurring together like shadows underwater. I turned my headlights off and on again just to be sure they weren't flickering. They weren't. Everything looked the same except for a small glint of light deeper in the trees, like someone holding a phone or flashlight. I leaned forward, trying to see better, and the light blinked once, then disappeared. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I hit the gas, determined to push through whatever loop or trick of road I'd stumbled into. The fog thinned for a second, and I thought maybe I'd broken free. Then the pine returned, waiting at the edge of my high beams. It's hard to explain what that does to your mind. You start questioning things that shouldn't need questioning. Did I drive in a circle? No, the road was straight. Was there a hidden intersection? None that I'd seen. Was my brain misfiring, replaying the same image out of panic? Possibly. But then why did the odometer still rise, mile by mile, as if the car moved forward through time but not space? I kept glancing at it, 83,429, 83,430, and every time the number changed, the scenery didn't. At some point, the air got colder. My breath began to fog the windshield from the inside, and I swear I could hear something faint beneath the hum of the engine, like a voice carried on static. I turned off the radio, thinking maybe some nearby CB frequency was bleeding in, but the sound continued. It wasn't speech exactly, more like a rhythmic murmuring, too low to catch words but steady, almost matching the thrum of my tires. When I slowed, it slowed. When I accelerated, it grew louder. The fog ahead rippled as if stirred by wind, though the trees stood perfectly still. Then far ahead in my high beams, I saw a figure, just standing in the road, maybe 50 yards away. My first thought was a lost driver or a hunter, someone flagging me down. I braked carefully and leaned forward. The figure didn't move. It was tall, thin, wearing what looked like a coat or long shirt that hung to its knees. Its head was tilted slightly to one side, as if listening. I flashed my high beams once, nothing. I rolled down my window halfway and shouted, "Hey, you okay?" My voice vanished into the fog like it had been swallowed. The figure began to walk toward me, slow and uneven, each step jerking slightly like something learning to move. I threw the car into reverse. The engine revved and the tires squealed, but instead of moving backward, it felt like the car resisted, like the asphalt itself was holding me in place. The figure drew closer, and I realized its face wasn't visible at all. It was just a hollow blur, darker than the fog around it. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished, fading into the mist like a smear wiped clean from glass. When it was gone, the air went utterly silent. Even the engine sounded distant, like I was hearing it through water. I gripped the steering wheel, every muscle rigid, and pressed the accelerator again. The car lurched forward, the tires spinning slightly before catching, and I sped past the pine, the sign, and whatever invisible line separated one loop from the next. My hands were slick with sweat, my throat tight. I must have driven another 5, maybe 10 miles before I dared to slow down. The road still refused to change. At one point, desperate, I pulled over completely, turned off the ignition, and stepped out. The fog wrapped around me instantly, cool and damp, muffling everything. I left the car door open so I could see the interior light. The ground beneath my boots was firm, gravelly. I thought about walking into the trees, maybe finding a clearing, but something about their stillness warned me not to. I leaned against the hood and took a deep breath. The air smelled faintly of gasoline and something else, something metallic. Then I noticed faint grooves in the asphalt at my feet, tire tracks, multiple layers of them, overlapping again and again. I crouched and ran my fingers over them. They matched my own tread pattern perfectly. When I got back in the car, my phone buzzed once. I grabbed it immediately, thinking maybe service had returned. But the notification wasn't from any app I recognized. It just said, Mile 0 reset. The screen flickered once, then went black. I tried the ignition again, but the engine wouldn't start this time. I sat there staring at the fog, listening to that low murmuring sound drift closer until I finally saw movement in the rearview mirror. The figure was back, standing behind the car now, barely visible in the dim glow of my taillights. It wasn't walking this time. It was standing perfectly still, head tilted, the faint outline of its body pulsing slightly like it was breathing in rhythm with the road itself. The murmuring grew louder, filling my ears until I couldn't tell if it was outside or in my head. Then, as the light dimmed further, I realized the figure wasn't alone. More shapes stood just beyond the tree line, half hidden by the fog, all watching. The next thing I remember clearly is waking up to daylight streaming through the windshield. My neck was stiff, my hand still gripping the wheel. The fog was gone and the pine tree stood ahead of me like before. But this time the sign was missing. My phone was dead. When I finally got the car started and reversed back down the road, it led me straight to Highway 59 in less than 3 minutes. I glanced at the odometer once I hit the main highway again, 83,420. Exactly 1 mile less than when I'd first turned onto that road. I told myself the numbers had glitched, that exhaustion had made me hallucinate, but when I got home and washed the car the next day, I found fine scratches running along both sides of the vehicle, as if branches had clawed at it. Except there hadn't been any close enough to touch. I haven't taken that route again. I don't think anyone should. Some nights, though, when I'm driving near Lufkin and the fog rolls in low across the ground, I check the odometer out of habit. Once, when the needle quivered between digits, I swear I heard that same faint murmuring rise beneath the hum of the tires, steady and patient, like something counting down the miles until the road decides to begin again. It was just after midnight when I pulled into the rest stop off I-20, somewhere between Tyler and Longview. The rain had been chasing me for miles, tapping across the windshield like restless fingers, and my gas gauge had been flirting with empty since I passed Canton. The place looked deserted from the highway, one flickering light above the vending machines, a row of dark semis sleeping under the drizzle, and a squat brick building housing the bathrooms and the little information booth. I left the engine running for a moment, watching the rain pool under the yellow sodium light, then grabbed my jacket and made a run for it. The air smelled like wet asphalt and pine needles, that East Texas dampness that seeps into everything. Inside the rest stop building, the fluorescent lights hummed, casting a flat, washed-out glow on the tiled floor. I could hear water dripping from somewhere near the ceiling vent. The men's room door creaked when I pushed it open, and I half expected to find someone in there. It just had that feeling, like a place still holding its breath after someone had left. I washed my hands, splashed my face, and was about to head back out when I heard a sound behind me, soft but distinct, a woman's voice. It came from the other side of the wall near the women's restroom. She said, "Hello? Can someone help me?" Her voice trembled like she'd been crying for a long time. At first, I thought maybe she was locked in. I stepped out into the open area between the two doors and knocked lightly on the women's side. "You okay in there?" I called. Nothing at first, just the faint sound of the rain outside. Then she spoke again, closer this time, just on the other side of the door. "Please, my car broke down. I need to call my husband." I told her there was a payphone near the vending machines, but she didn't answer right away. Then she said, almost whispering, "I can't go out there. He's waiting." That stopped me. I looked back toward the parking lot, but it was empty except for my car and the trucks. I could see my own reflection in the wet pavement through the glass door. No one else. "Who's waiting?" I asked, but she didn't respond. The handle rattled suddenly like she was trying to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. I noticed then that the door wasn't locked. It didn't even have a latch from the outside. I told her to try again, but she said, "It won't let me." Not "I can't." Not "it's stuck." "It won't let me." I felt a strange chill even though the air was humid. Something in her tone wasn't right, like she was talking about the door as if it were alive. I hesitated, listening, and heard a faint scraping sound from inside, like shoes dragging lightly across tile. I took a step back, unsure what to do, when the motion sensor above the women's door clicked and the light over it flickered on. That was odd. Those sensors only picked up movement right outside, not behind the door. Then I heard her again, but this time her voice was lower, closer to the crack of the door, saying, "You shouldn't be here." I turned toward the exit, half expecting someone else to walk in, maybe a trucker, maybe a cop, but the glass door only reflected the empty lobby and the dim vending machines outside. When I looked back, the door to the women's room was slightly open, just enough to see the edge of the sink and the corner of a mirror inside. I could swear I hadn't heard it move. I said, "Ma'am?" But she didn't answer. The door creaked wider, and I caught sight of something. A shape standing near the sinks, long hair clinging wet to her shoulders, a pale dress that looked more gray than white in the fluorescent light. She was facing the mirror, not me. I pushed the door open a little more, trying to see if she needed help. But as soon as I crossed the threshold, the lights in the restroom flickered violently, like a power surge. The reflection in the mirror shifted, not like she moved, but like it did. The woman in the mirror turned her head toward me, even though the real woman hadn't moved at all. Her reflection looked straight at me, eyes wide and black, mouth slightly open as if she was trying to form words she couldn't say. My stomach dropped. I stepped back into the hallway, heart pounding. Then everything went dark for about 2 seconds. When the lights came back on, the door was swinging shut on its own. I grabbed it before it closed completely and looked inside. The room was empty. No woman, no sound, no movement. Just the dripping faucet and the hum of the old fluorescent tubes. I even checked each stall, nothing. When I walked back outside, I saw a man standing by one of the trucks. He looked like a long hauler, gray beard, flannel jacket, coffee thermos in hand. I told him what I'd seen, half laughing at how crazy it sounded, but he didn't smile. He just looked at me for a moment and said, "You saw her too." I asked him what he meant, and he nodded slowly. "That woman shows up around this time every few years. White dress, long hair, always asking for help by that door. State troopers came through here back in '93 after she disappeared. Car broke down same spot down the road. Never found her, just her purse in the women's bathroom. Folks say she doesn't know she's gone." He said it in a matter-of-fact way, like someone describing a familiar ghost. I asked if he'd ever talked to her, and he said, "Once I was filling my thermos and she asked if I'd seen her husband. When I said no, she looked toward the highway and said, 'He promised he'd come back.' Then she just walked away. But not toward the road, toward the woods behind the building. The rain had stopped by then, and the night air was still, heavy with that damp pine scent. I went back to my car, feeling the weight of what I'd just heard. I told myself it was exhaustion, that I'd been driving too long. But when I started the engine, I glanced once more toward the building. The light above the women's restroom flickered again, and for a split second, I thought I saw her standing there by the door, one hand lifted, as if she was still waiting for someone to open it. I didn't stick around to see if she'd move. I drove off, tires spitting water from the pavement, eyes fixed on the thin beam of my headlights cutting through the dark pines. A few miles later, my radio cut out for a second, replaced by static, and in that static I could have sworn I heard a faint voice say, "He's still out there." When I got home the next morning, I looked her up, East Texas missing woman, I-20 rest stop, 93. Her name was Lisa Garrison, 27 years old. Last seen leaving her broken-down Buick to walk toward the restroom while her husband went to get gas. They never found her body. Her husband died in a wreck the next day on his way back to her. The article mentioned something strange, that her watch was found later, years later, buried in the wall during a renovation. Still ticking. I don't stop at rest areas anymore, not at night. Every time I pass one, I slow down just enough to see the yellow light over the door. Sometimes I think I see movement, a figure standing there like she's still waiting. And sometimes when the radio crackles, I change the station, because I don't ever want to hear that voice again asking if I can help her. It was close to midnight when Clay Rollins turned onto the two-lane road that cut through the pine woods east of Nacogdoches. He'd finished late at the garage again, trying to get a customer's Ford F-250 ready before deer season. The air was thick still and the kind of dark that made you feel swallowed up. His headlights picked out only a slice of the forest at a time, the white beams slicing through fog that had begun to creep low to the ground like smoke. Clay wasn't one for ghost stories or local legends, but that stretch of road had always made him uneasy. It wasn't just the shadows or the way the trees seemed to lean in. It was the silence between the trees, the sense that the woods were holding their breath. He'd mounted a dash cam a few months back after a close call with a hog that darted across the highway. It wasn't anything fancy, just something he'd picked up from the auto parts store. It turned on with the ignition, recorded over itself every few hours. Clay didn't think much about it, but that night it would end up showing him something he wished he'd never seen. About 20 miles east of town, just past a broken-down sign for an old sawmill, Clay noticed something move on the shoulder ahead. At first he thought it was another deer, maybe even a dog. He eased off the gas, squinting through the windshield. The thing moved again, but slower this time, like it was crawling. The high beams caught the wet reflection of skin, pale and raw-looking. It was a person. Or at least it looked like one. Clay braked hard, his tires crunching the gravel at the road's edge. The figure froze, crouched on all fours, head low. He could see long strands of hair clumped against its neck, slick with mud. Its hands, or what he thought were hands, were splayed in front of it like it was bracing to spring. The fog had thickened, curling around the beams of his headlights so that everything seemed both too close and far away. Then the figure moved fast. It scrambled toward the trees, limbs jerking in strange, uneven bursts, like it didn't know how its joints were supposed to work. Clay's stomach flipped. He grabbed his phone, hit record on the dashcam's app just in time to catch the last bit of it disappearing into the woods. The trees shook briefly, then went still again. He sat there for a long minute, heart hammering, every instinct telling him to keep driving. But he was a mechanic, practical-minded, not someone who believed in things creeping through the woods. Maybe it was a junkie someone hurt or lost. Against better judgment, he put the truck in park, grabbed his flashlight, and stepped out. The air outside was cold enough to sting his nose. The smell of pine sap and damp dirt filled his lungs. He walked to the edge of the ditch where the figure had crossed. The grass was flattened and he could see prints in the mud, long gouges like someone had dragged themselves forward with their fingertips. He shone the light deeper into the woods. The beam caught movement again, a flicker of white between the trunks. "Hey," Clay called out, voice steady but cautious. "You okay out there?" No answer. The woods swallowed the sound. Then came a noise, not a voice, but something like a low breath being drawn in too close. Clay's skin went cold. He turned, scanning the trees, the road, the ditch, but saw nothing. He backed toward the truck slowly, keeping the light steady on the tree line. When he reached the door, he climbed in, locked it, and put the truck in gear. The rest of the drive home felt like a dream. The fog followed him for miles. When he finally pulled into his gravel driveway outside Nacogdoches, the security light flicked on, washing his yard in pale orange. His hands shook as he reached to turn off the ignition. He told himself he'd check the footage in the morning, that maybe it was just a person having a bad night, maybe someone tweaking out near the woods. But he couldn't sleep. Around 2:30, he went into the kitchen, poured himself some coffee, and set up his phone to review the dashcam feed. The video was crisp. The night had been still enough that the sound came through clear, The hum of the tires, the hiss of the engine, his own breath when he'd stopped. Then came the shape crawling from the ditch. Watching it again, Clay realized how wrong it had looked. The limbs weren't bending right. The arms were too long. The head turned toward the headlights, but the face was lost in glare. He scrubbed back and forth through the footage, trying to make sense of the motion. When he paused on a frame, he thought he saw something strange in the reflection of the windshield. He leaned closer. In the faint ghost glare of his own face reflected against the glass, another face stared back at him, pale with eyes wide open. It wasn't part of the scene outside. It was looking straight at him through the reflection, matching his posture perfectly. Clay froze. He blinked. So did the reflection. Every blink, every tilt of his head it followed exactly, but a beat too late, like it was learning. He closed the app, set the phone down, and sat still for what felt like an hour. The clock on the wall ticked in steady rhythm. Finally, he laughed it off. It had to be some video glitch, something the dashcam's compression did. He'd seen weird reflections before on windshields. The brain made patterns out of noise all the time. Still, when he went to bed, he left the hallway light on. The next day at the shop, he told his coworker Jace about it. Jace was younger, all tattoos and energy drinks, the kind of guy who loved ghost videos. Clay pulled up the clip to show him, but the file wouldn't open. Every video from that night was corrupted. Black screen, static, nothing else. The app crashed each time he tried. Jace shrugged. Probably just a bad SD card, man. Happens all the time. But Clay noticed something else. His phone camera started glitching too. Whenever he switched to selfie mode, it took a half-second longer to focus. And every time it did, he swore there was something faint in the background behind him. A shape maybe, or a face half-lit gone before he could catch it. By that evening, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. In the reflection of the shop's window as he locked up, he thought he saw someone standing behind him in the darkened garage bay. Too tall, too still. When he turned, there was nothing there but the smell of oil and rubber. That night, the dashcam turned on by itself. Clay heard the click through the open window from his driveway. He went outside with a flashlight. The truck was locked, engine cold, but the camera's little red light was blinking. He unplugged it, took it inside, and dropped it on the counter. He didn't sleep. The following morning, his phone buzzed with a notification. New video detected. The thumbnail showed his own living room, recorded from the counter where the dashcam sat. The video was short, maybe 10 seconds. It showed him asleep in his recliner, head tilted to the side, the TV still on. The footage had been taken from a few feet away. Behind him, near the hallway, something moved. Clay watched it 3 times, each slower than before. The shape behind him looked like a person crawling into frame on all fours, but the head wasn't right. The jaw hung open, too far, like it was dislocated. Its eyes didn't blink. They flickered white, syncing in rhythm with the dashcam light. He deleted the video immediately, unplugged the dashcam, and drove it 10 miles out to a dumpster behind a gas station. On the drive back, he felt lighter, almost relieved. But that night, when he passed by the front window, the reflection of his living room glass caught him mid-step. He blinked. His reflection didn't, it smiled instead. He stood there for a long time, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence, trying to tell himself it was a trick of the light. Then slowly the reflection leaned forward until its face filled the glass, nose almost touching the inside of the pane. Its mouth moved, but no sound came out. Clay turned and ran out the front door into the yard. The house lights flickered behind him. He called the sheriff, voice shaking, trying to explain, but by the time a deputy arrived, the reflection was gone. The dashcam somehow was back in his truck. The deputy, a tired-looking man named Whitaker, didn't find anything unusual. "You sure you ain't been working too many hours?" he asked. Clay didn't answer. 2 nights later, Whitaker came back on his own. He said he'd been reviewing his body cam footage from that visit. He'd seen something strange reflected in the window behind Clay's shoulder. Something moving that shouldn't have been there. When he looked again the next morning, the file had corrupted. The timestamp on the file changed too, rewritten to the exact minute Whitaker had fallen asleep that night. No one saw Clay Rollins again after that weekend. His truck was found idling near the same stretch of road where he'd first seen the thing. The dash cam was on, recording nothing but fog and faint movement between the trees. But if you watch the footage, really watch it frame by frame, there's a moment when the fog thins and you can see something standing just beyond the headlights. Not crawling anymore, standing upright, watching. And if you pause it right there, you'll see something else reflected faintly in the windshield. A pair of eyes, blinking when you do. On that lonely stretch of farm-to-market road 287, the kind of place where the mesquite trees lean like old men and the asphalt buckles in the heat, the call boxes had long since been taken out of service. They'd been left standing, hollow and sun-faded, relics of a time before cell towers claimed every mile of open road. But one of them still worked. Or at least, that's what Trooper David Lang heard the night the call came through. He'd been parked under the orange hum of a rest area light just outside of Quanah, finishing a cup of burnt coffee that tasted like pennies. Dispatch crackled through the radio. A brief burst of static followed by a voice. Unit 117U near 287? 10-4, Lang said. Why? We got a call from a roadside emergency box near mile marker 62. Come again? You heard me. Call box went live. Lines active. Caller reported a wreck. Single vehicle, rollover. Those boxes haven't worked in 20 years, Lang said, half chuckling. Guess one of them does, dispatch said. Caller was male, sounded panicked. Said he saw a red pickup in the ditch. Then the line went dead. Lang dropped his cup, coffee splashing across the dashboard. You trace it? Can't. Analog line, old infrastructure. We only got a general location from the signal burst. Copy that. I'll head that way. He flicked on his lights, though no one else was around to see, and pulled on to 287. The night was starless, the kind of black that swallowed the world whole. His spotlight cut through the emptiness, showing nothing but roadside weeds and the shimmer of heat ghosts rising from the pavement. The air smelled faintly of oil and cedar. He drove slow, scanning both shoulders for skid marks or tire tracks. When he reached mile 62, he saw the call box standing crooked near a curve, its paint flaked down to gray metal. Its little red door hung open. Lang parked on the shoulder and stepped out, boots crunching gravel. He could hear crickets and the distant buzz of power lines. Nothing else. The call box phone dangled by its cord, swinging slightly as if someone had just let it go. Highway patrol, he said softly, pulling it up. The receiver was cold. He pressed it to his ear. A low hum filled it, like the old dial tone that used to precede every call. Then a faint click. Hello? Lang said. There was silence, then a voice, male, strained, whispering. There's been a crash. Where are you? Lang said. Can you describe your location? You're close, the voice said. It just happened. Lang turned slowly, looking down the dark stretch of highway. His flashlight beam swept over brush and dirt, nothing more. I don't see a wreck. What kind of vehicle? Red, the voice said. Pick up. He was going too fast around the bend. Lang's heart ticked a little faster. All right, sir, can you tell me your name? There was a pause. The voice came quieter. You're not going to make it in time. Make it in time for what? The line went dead. Lang stared at the phone for a long moment, the wind pushing through the grass like something breathing. He hung it back up, then started checking the ditches with his light. No debris, no tracks, no sign of a crash. He climbed back into his cruiser and called dispatch. Control, I'm at the box. No wreck found. Copy, you said the line was still active? Yeah, caller said there'd been a red pickup crash. I've checked both directions, nothing. We'll note it, dispatch said. Could have been a prank. You heading back? Lang hesitated. I'll give it another mile or two. He rolled forward slowly, following the curve the caller mentioned. The road cut between low hills, and at the bottom of one he saw it, a single fresh set of tire tracks leading off the shoulder into a culvert. He braked hard, threw on his flashers, and got out. The grass was torn up, and a faint glint of metal caught his light. A red Ford F-150 lay overturned, the roof crushed flat against the rocks. The windshield was spiderwebbed and smeared with blood. Lang's breath caught. Control, I found it, he said. Single vehicle rollover. Send EMS. Copy, any survivors? He shined the beam through the window. A man was slumped over the steering wheel, head twisted unnaturally. The engine clicked softly as it cooled. Negative. He's gone. There was a pause on the radio. Roger that. Time of discovery? Lang checked his watch. 2:24 a.m. He leaned closer to the cab. The man's phone was wedged between the seats, the screen shattered. His knuckles were white against the steering wheel. Something about the way his arm hung caught Lang's eye. The wristwatch glinted faintly. Same model as his own department issued one. He frowned and turned the beam toward the man's face. For a second, his stomach dropped. The hairline, the jaw, it looked like him. Enough to make his knees feel weak. But the angle, the light, maybe it was just coincidence. He took a step back. "You're rattled, Dave," he muttered to himself. He waited for backup, keeping his light trained on the wreck. After 10 minutes, he glanced back up the hill. The call box stood silhouetted against the night, its little red door still open. The phone wasn't swinging anymore. It was gone. Lang squinted, swept his light around, but saw no one. He started back toward his car, uneasy. Before he could reach it, the radio hissed again. "Unit 117, you near 287? It was dispatch, same tone as before. Lang froze. "Copy," he said cautiously. "Why?" "We got a call from a roadside emergency box near mile marker 62, dispatch said. Caller reported a red pickup in the ditch." "I just called that in," Lang said sharply. "No, sir," dispatch said. "That was less than a minute ago." His mouth went dry. He looked toward the box again. The night was empty. "Describe the caller," Lang said. "Male," dispatch replied. Sounded panicked. Said he saw a trooper's cruiser pulled over. Then the line went dead. Lang lowered the radio slowly, staring through the dark toward the wreck. The air was still except for the insects. He turned back to his car, but as he reached for the handle, he saw the reflection in the window. The callbox light, one that hadn't worked in decades, was glowing faintly behind him, casting a dull red halo over the asphalt. It pulsed once, then again like a slow heartbeat. He looked down the road, and in the shimmer of that dying light he saw the shape of a man standing next to it, one hand on the receiver. He couldn't see the face, just the posture, familiar. The man raised the phone slowly to his ear. Lang's radio hissed again. "Unit 117, do you copy?" Dispatch's voice was faint, distorted. "Caller says the trooper didn't make it." The red light blinked one final time and went dark. Lang stood there for a long while, the wind carrying the faint smell of burnt rubber and metal. When the other units finally arrived 20 minutes later, they found his cruiser idling on the shoulder, driver's door open, headlights sweeping the field. There was no sign of Lang. Only the callbox door swaying in the wind, tapping lightly against the pole like a slow and patient knock. We called it a church because that is what the sign used to say before the weather took the paint. County 12, Church of the Narrow Gate, was there in ghost letters if you leaned your head and let your eyes blur. It sat at the very end of the road, where Caliche turned to two ruts and the mesquite closed in, past the burned pasture and the private property signs shot through with birdshot. The bell tower had no bell, only a black square like a missing tooth. It had a door with a horizontal crack where the boards had swelled and split, and it had windows tall as men and skinned with bubbled stained glass, the saints bent out, of true by heat and time. It had a smell that did not belong to the panhandle or the hill country or anywhere we knew. It was a sweet and headachy smell, like the cheap candles they sell near the register at the feed store, cut with old dust and mouse droppings and the dry ache of cedar. We got out there because Trent had a brother who knew a boy who said he had once slept in the baptistry on a dare and woke up with his skin tacky, like he had spilled syrup all over himself in the night. The story was ridiculous, which meant it was worth a Friday night. There were 5 of us, which is the kind of number that feels safe until you are counting who is left. We had my grandma's truck, which rattled like a bag of wrenches and a cooler of Dr. Peppers, and the kind of bravado that only lives in a narrow slice of age when you are still too new to understand that most places are not abandoned because nobody wanted them. The drive out past fields that looked rough-shaved, the stubble silver in the moonlight. The air was so dry it rang. We turned down County 12, where the 2 mailboxes leaned toward each other like gossiping women, and bumped along until the road became suggestion. I watched the needle grass lift its whiskers in the wash of the headlights. Mara sat next to me with her knees up in my hoodie, fingers worrying the drawstring into little coils. Sierra and Luis were in the back, arguing about whether coyotes sounded like women screaming or babies crying and laughing at each other for pretending either of them knew. Trent stood behind me in the bed of the truck, braced on his boots, riding the bumps with cowboy confidence that would have looked cooler if he had not knocked his head on the cab twice. We found the church by its absence of movement, a box of stillness in a night full of insects. When we cut the engine, the noise of the dark flooded in. There were crickets and a flat distant sound that might have been irrigation, and might have been the highway miles away. The church soaked up the starlight and hid it. For a half second I had the urge to honk, like maybe someone would stick a head out and wave us off. No one did. Up close, the door was stuck on something soft. We shouldered it, and there was a sound low and wet like a candy peeling off foil. The smell hit first and made my eyes sting. It was not resting smell, but working smell, sweet and warm, a store of candles with every wick lit. Mara made a face and pressed the sleeve of my hoodie to her nose. When the door kicked free, we saw why, and none of us spoke for a few seconds, which is the longest silence 5 teenagers can manage. The pews were full. Every single bench from the front to the back row was taken. There were men in suits out of style by 40 years. There were women with hats like folded pastries. There were children with hair and stiff ribbons. They stared straight ahead with eyes the color of candle ends, milky and filmed. Their hands were laced. Their mouths were closed. They were made of wax thick as tallow, poured and scraped and smoothed until they looked almost real, and then not real at all, and then real again in the way a corpse resembles a sleeping person, until you notice the little wrongnesses that have nothing to do with breath. Sierra whispered that we should go. Her voice sounded damp, like the church had sucked the air and chewed it before handing it back. Trent said they were props, probably from a Halloween thing, and the bravado in his voice wore feathers of fear. Luis walked down the center aisle with the flashlight on his phone pointed low. He swept the beam over laps and thighs and shoes shiny with a finish like gloss paint. On the floor under the benches lay drips and puddled edges where wax had sloughed. The slats had the faint bow that comes when enough weight sits long enough in the same place. The figures were not hollow like mannequins. They had weight. That was what my head kept circling back to. Wax had weight, and somebody had carried it here as if they were walking cousins back in from supper. Mara squeezed my elbow and nodded toward the front where the pulpit sat under a wooden cross scabbed with nail holes. There was a figure in the first pew, end seat nearest the aisle. It was a teenager with hair like a field in wind. The long boy shag that used to be in all the yearbooks from the county school. The head was tilted. The shoulders were hunched. The hands were folded like the others, but the line of the body was not cold, if a posture can be warm. I realized I was thinking in ridiculous ways to avoid what my skin already knew. Heat rose from it, not like body heat with that fuzz of animal on the edge. This was heat like the scent of a cake cooling on a rack. It was fresh. It was new. It was still in the process of being itself. Luis crouched, then jerked his hand back before he touched. He did not need to tell us he had felt it. He was good at jokes, but had lost them for the moment. There was something damp and fragile in all of us, like we were paper cups sweating cold water. Trent leaned over it and said a name that did not belong to anyone we knew. He said Caleb in a voice smaller than his throat. He told us his brother's friend's friend had mentioned a kid named Caleb, who disappeared in the 80s, who was last seen walking home from the old quarry. Trent never shut up. He shut up now. He looked like he had been told something about the world he loved, and it had not been a kind thing. I should have said we were leaving, or should have said that we had seen enough and could all go make fun of Trent for being a baby in the truck. I did not say anything because there was a sound like someone humming through their nose. It came from the wall behind the pulpit. There was a door there, narrow as a closet door, almost the color of the boards around it, framed by 2 hymn boards hung blank. It looked like something you would open when you wanted to duck quickly out of sight. The sound deepened until it was a voice if you did not listen too closely and a machine if you did. It had the rhythm of a sermon recorded on a loop, up and down with edges sanded off by repetition. The words were nearly words. They melted on the tongue of the speaker and slid down the cracks of the door. Sierra wanted it closed and locked. She spoke with her chin. She had this way of being brave that was really an attempt at controlling the only thing she could. She walked straight up the aisle past all those polite wax faces with her phone light making oil slick arcs. She put her hand on the door. It was warm. I could tell because she flinched and pressed her palm to her jeans and then did it again in that stubborn way she has when a little pain proves she is still the author of her own choices. The knob turned. The door opened inward into dark the color of an old bruise. The warmth spilled out. If the outside air had been a dry cloth, this air was a damp wool blanket. The hum filled the nave and climbed into the rafters and shook out dust that came down in a light snow, settling on polished wax heads like dandruff. Trent said no. He said it with his face, not his mouth. He did not want anything more to happen, and understood that wanting had nothing to do with it. There were steps going down into the earth. The light from Sierra's phone stopped on the cut edge of the third step like it had been bitten. The smell was stronger. It had a note of cotton and musk, the kind of scent that tags along on church ladies' sweaters. But under that was the unmistakable base of paraffin, the same smell you get when you snip wicks. Mara touched my wrist with 2 fingers and told me in a voice that would have been scolding if it had not trembled, that we were not going into a cellar beneath an abandoned church in the middle of nowhere. I nodded and then found myself following Sierra anyway because something in the humming voice had the cadence of my own name, even though it did not say it. We went down. Our feet made damp sounds on wood. The hum settled into our ribs. At the bottom was a room that might have been a fellowship hall once. I could see the bones of it. There was a countertop with a dead outlet and a coffee urn fossilized in stains. There were folding tables leaned against a wall where posters had hung, corners torn away in triangles. There was a closet door braced open with a chair. There was a long metal trough with steps leading down into it, like a feed bunk for cattle but narrower, and it took me a second to understand what it was, because I had never seen one that did not hold water. This had a skin of pale stuff on it that looked like cooled soup if you were trying not to gag. Mara swallowed so hard I could hear it. The surface shivered a half inch at a time like something breathed under it. The wall across from the trough was pegboard, the kind you put hooks in to hang tools. Hanging there were things that would not have been frightening if they had not been there. Ladles, brushes, scissors snipped into combs, meat thermometers, a cheap radio with a broken antenna, the speakers buzzing that same knot voice like a beehive kept behind glass. Above them were words painted in a hand steady as a hardware clerk's. Be still. Hold until set. Trim the wick. Trent said, "This is stupid," 3 times. He kept his voice low to avoid waking something. Louise stepped on something that clicked and hissed, and for a second the room brightened like a thought. A space heater had come on, its coils licking with orange and then dying because there was nothing in the outlet to feed it. The hum stuttered and rose into a completely intelligible sentence. It said that skin is just a vessel and you could pour yourself into anything if you believed hard enough. Then it dropped back into a drone, and I was left with the prickling knowledge that it had not been a hallucination we had all shared. The radio had a cassette deck and the slot was full. The trough bucked. Not much, just enough to wobble the skin of whatever lay on it. A flare of heat came through the room. I remembered the warm figure in the pew above us and felt something in my chest pull tight. Sierra whispered behind me, and I could not tell if she meant for me to answer. She asked what the opposite of baptism was. I pulled the ignition key out of my pocket and held it like it would be useful against anything. I thought about the times we had bought cheap candles to make the power feel less like an inconvenience and more like a cozy problem. I thought about the way the wax softened in your fingers and took the shape of whatever you pressed it to. I thought about how easily it accepts fingerprints and how easily fingerprints blur. We heard footsteps above us in the nave. Not heavy, the sound of a lot of small things moving at once. The air on the back of my neck cooled. Trent whispered that the figures had stood up at last, and then I hated him because I felt that picture enter me and sit down. We moved without discussing it up and back, because all the bravery we had was balanced on the fact that we could leave if we chose to. It felt suddenly like a lie others had told on our behalf. We went up the stairs in a hurry and spilled into the aisle, making more noise than we had planned. The pews were still full. They had not moved at all, and yet something had moved. Because the hymnals were open now to pages that had not been open. On each open page a name was written in a clumsy black marker, heavy downstrokes, a hand that had pressed hard. I saw Caleb and I saw Ruth and I saw names of people I had seen once at the feed store and never bothered to learn. Then I saw Luis written on one and felt the world go tight as a jar lid. Luis swore and flipped the book closed with more force than necessary. The paper wrinkled. The sound of it was obscene in the hush. On the bench in front of us another book lay open and it said Sierra in the same hand, and another said Trent. And I felt my lungs forget how to decide when to pull and when to push. The warm one at the front was warmer. I knew without touching. There was the faintest sheen now on its hair, a softening at the line of the mouth. The air trembled with the heat of it, the updraft that you get over blacktop at noon. This heat did not feel dangerous. It felt patient. It felt like someone urging us to sit, to be still. to listen hard to a voice that was trying to help us be something we were not yet. The front door was a square of darker dark. It did not look far. We started for it slow because something in us still wanted to be polite. We edged past elbows and hats and a child's stiff curls. I saw the fine cracks in a cheek where the maker had pinched the wax and smoothed it, and the memory of his fingers had never quite gone away. One of the figures had a drip on its chin like it had been eating and missed its mouth. It made me want to laugh and made me feel sick. When we got to the midpoint of the aisle, the door clicked. That was all. Just a click, something old settling, a latch changing its mind. The sound went through us like a little steel needle. Sierra broke first. She ran. She is not a runner, not by habit. But she ran like she would run into a burning room if the person she loved most were inside. She hit the door with both hands and yanked it. It opened. Night air came in, full of grass and the faraway smell of cattle. She looked back, her mouth a bright O in the pale of her face, and then she stopped looking back and went out. Trent went after her and almost fell on the step because he did not lift enough for the threshold. Luis pushed at me and I caught Mara's arm and we went. Outside, the world was too big and too empty and perfect in a way I had not noticed on the way in. The stars had multiplied. The road shone like bone. We got to the truck, and for a second it was a game again. Piling in, slamming doors, yelling, "Go." My key scraped the ignition collar. The smell of wax had followed us, soft as breath, and sat down in the cab like an old woman joining her people. I turned the key and the starter made the dry grind my grandma's truck had been practicing for years. It caught, then did not. I turned it again and Trent pounded the dash and Luis told him to shut it, and the third time it caught for real, the engine barking and then settling into its rattling cough. We pulled away. I did not peel out because dust would blind us, and also because you do not make the kind of noise that tells something you are scared. I drove like we were late to be somewhere important, and being late meant the end of something we valued. The church got smaller in the mirror, a neat black square on the prairie. I would have been fine never seeing it again, but the road curved and brought it into view again from an angle, and I could not stop myself from looking. There were shadows moving in those tall windows, not big, just a stirring. The warm figure in the front row was seated where we had left it, but for a second, and I do not know if I believe my own memory, I thought I saw my hoodie pulled up on its shoulders. I had not left it there. Mara had it. She had her face in it. She looked over at me with my hood tied loose under her chin like a child's bonnet, and asked in a voice that was not quite hers if I smelled something. She said we smelled like candles. She laughed to make it not a big thing, and the sound broke on the ends like it had been poured into a cold mold. We did not tell anyone. When you have a story that you know someone will not believe, you keep it, hugging it like evidence that you were ever that young and stupid and alive. Things should have ended there, the way summer nights end, falling into other summer nights until school comes and you stop measuring them like precious coins. But over the next week there were little changes that were not little. Luis worked at his uncle's garage and burned his forearm on a muffler. He sent a picture to our group chat and it should have looked ugly. It looked clean, the skin slicked and smoothed without blister. He said it did not hurt exactly. He said it felt numb and hot at the same time. Sierra started carrying a lighter even though she did not smoke. She flicked it open and shut in class until the history teacher took it and said something about rules and the state fire marshal that made everybody smile. After Sierra told me she liked the way it tasted in the air, Mara found wax flecks in the pocket of my hoodie that were not there before. She rolled one between her fingers and it took her fingerprint and kept it. She pressed it onto my wrist like a childish rub-on tattoo, and when I peeled it up later, the pattern of whorls stayed. On my skin as a shine that did not wash off with soap. The first night, I woke and smelled the church. I lay in the dark and told myself it was a dream. The second night I woke to the sound of humming, not unlike the heater in our hallway when it is trying to decide whether to live another winter. The third night I woke and sat up and saw on my dresser the short squat shape of a jar candle I knew I had never owned. It was one of those cheap ones with a saint on the label. The label had no face. The glass was cloudy where heat had fogged it and cooled again. The wick was black. There was no soot on the ceiling. I told myself I was sleeping with my eyes open. I told myself a lot of things. People in town started showing up to church that had not gone in years. Not the County 12 church. That place had been forgotten on purpose. They went to the new ones with projectors and coffee carts. They stood with their hands up and faces soft and their mouths moving. I watched a video from one of those services that somebody's aunt posted and saw, in the third row, the woman who owns the laundromat with her hands clasped in a way that made the tendons in her fingers shine like strings. Something about the angle of her chin looked poured rather than born. I deleted the thought like a bad number in a math problem, and it came back the next day. The boy who bags at the grocery started wearing a bracelet of rubber bands. He snapped them against his wrist and left a crescent moon of impressions that did not fill back in. He smiled when he did it. The image of the trough came back with a slap, and I had to put my hands on the steering wheel and breathe hard. We were not a group anymore. That is how it is when something is bigger than a story but smaller than a disaster. It presses people apart until they can fit around it. Trent texted me a picture of the church sign 2 nights later. It looked exactly the same, tasteful in its decay. He had gone back with his brother and a 6-pack. He wrote that it was boring. He wrote that the pews were empty. I did not believe him until the third angle. Empty pews, no hats, no curled hair, no glossy shoes. The floor showed smears where the bodies had been, like a paw print of melted snow. He wrote that he rang the bell and remembered there was no bell and laughed. I did not reply because I did not know which part of the picture was the lie, and I did not want to ask and be told it was all true. I found a smear on the inside of my forearm where I had never leaned on anything. It shone in a steady oval like a drop had sat there a long time and cooled. When I pressed it with my thumb, it warmed again like something living under ice. I did not tell Mara. She had started sleeping with my hoodie in a pile on the pillow next to her face, even when the night was hot enough to make the sheets stick. On a Sunday afternoon, the sky turned the pale white it gets before heat lightning, and the air seemed to stop just to see what would happen. I drove out to County 12 alone. I did not tell myself I would only go to the turnoff, or only to the place where the mailboxes leaned. I did not tell myself anything. I parked in the same place where the grass had not quite recovered from our tires. I went to the door and put my hand on it and felt warmth as gentle as breath on my palm. I stood there with my head down like a dog asking to come in. The latch clicked. The door peeled. The smell stepped up and touched my face like a friend you have missed too long. It was empty. The pews had no congregation. The hymnals were closed and stacked. The front pew where the warm figure had been had a dark place on the end of the bench, an oval like a man had sat there sweating through his Sunday pants for years. The pulpit was bare except for something small in the center. I went up the aisle and saw it was a wick trimmer like the ones my mother kept in the kitchen junk drawer. Someone had cleaned it to a shine that meant love. I picked it up and put it down because my hand wanted to put it in my pocket. And I had a rumbling understanding that things you carry out of a place like this leave something of yours behind. The door behind the pulpit was ajar. The hum was quiet now, like whatever machine made it had grown tired or content. I went down the stairs. At the bottom, the fellowship room was cool and smelled even sweeter, like a bakery that makes only one thing. The trough sat there with the skin over it, not moving. I stood at the lip and watched my face in it. It was a poor mirror, cloudy and tremoring, but it showed me tired and drawn and too thin and younger than I felt. I lowered a finger until it touched the surface and the skin gave like the top of pudding. Heat came up the bone of my finger and into my hand. I stuck my finger in my mouth without thinking. The taste was not human. I thought of Sierra asking about the opposite of baptism and understood that sometimes there is not an opposite. There is only the same thing in a different direction. There was a reel-to-reel machine on the counter I had not noticed before, the kind you see in libraries and old training films. It was on. The reels turned slow as a tired fan. The tape was thin and brown and spoke as it moved and then spooled it back because it was tired of being believed. A voice that might have been a pastor said to be still in the same way wax is still, which is not absence but containment. It said there is a peace in being poured, in letting go of the little choices that make a person feel shredded at the end of a day. It said there is a reason we light candles for the dead and a reason candles look like people if you squint. It said we could keep the shape and lose the ache. It said a lot of things that would sound silly written down, and none of it sounded silly in that room. It folded neatly into the place inside me where I kept the reasons I wanted to lie down during class and sleep without dreaming. I do not remember deciding to leave. I remember standing outside with the door shut behind me and my hands empty, and the sun was not where it had been. The cicadas were louder. My truck looked like something I had once owned and given to someone else. I found a smear on my forearm that was not there before, another oval, a perfect twin to the first, a little higher like stepping stones. I pressed it with my thumb. It did not give. It felt like part of me now, and maybe it had always been. In the days since I have started to catch my reflection looking aside when I am looking straight, like it is not a mirror but a window, and the person in it has other business. When I wash my hands, the water beads on the back of them and sits longer than it should before slipping away. People have begun to say I look calm. They mean it kindly. They mean they are relieved to see me settle down. Sometimes late, when the world has gone to its rooms and left the lights on in the hall, I wake to that warm, sweet smell and I understand that there are more pews somewhere and they are not empty. The congregation was not gone. It was everywhere. It was in the grocery store and the school auditorium and the oil change place and the long line of trucks at the Whataburger when the Friday night game ends. It was in the way people stood a little too straight at crosswalks and let their faces smooth out when the light was red. It was in me when I pinned my name badge and smoothed it with the flat of my palm and felt the faint give of myself under my own hand. The thought comes and I try to push it away and it leans and leans until it is the only thing left. I went back again last night, and at the end of County 12 the church was dark and ready and gentle with me. I did not bring anyone. I took off my shoes so they would not squeak on the floor. I walked down the aisle and sat in the front pew end seat. The wood was familiar and accepted me. I folded my hands. I watched the door behind the pulpit and waited for the hum. It came, steady and kind, and somewhere below a surface shivered. I do not know what will be left when morning comes. I do not know if I will be the warm shape someone else finds or if I will get up and go, a smooth version of myself, grateful to be finally easy to hold. If you drive out there, you might find the pews full again. You might catch a whiff of candles in the last heat of someone who just sat down. You might tell yourself it is nothing but a trick of summer in lonely places. You might be right. I do not want to argue. I only know that when I touch my forearm in the dark, there is a place that gives, and I can press my thumb in and leave a mark that lasts. And in a church at the end of a road that is barely a road at all, there is a trough holding the quietest thing I have ever wanted, and my name written in a hymn I have forgotten how to sing. Everyone in Llano acts like they don't look. They roll through town slow as a prayer, windows down to catch the river breeze and the smell of pecan smoke from Cooper's pits, and they aim their eyes anywhere but the sliver of glass over the dash. They learn to change lanes without glancing back, to back a trailer on memory and feel, to let their wives or husbands be the cautious ones. You start to notice the tape. It's different on every truck in Buick, a strip of black wrapped over the rear view, a red bandana knotted like a blindfold. Folks say it makes the heat worse, but they leave it anyway, like tying ribbon to a gate. They say it's about deer or glare or to keep the AC hitting right. They never mention the ridge, even when the ridge is the only thing the mirror gives you after dark. They never mention the man because there is nothing to be gained from inviting him by name. And because if you do it right, if you set your jaw and keep your eyes forward and drive like you're the kind of person who isn't owned by a superstition, you can make it home without seeing him. Most nights that works. Most nights is not all nights. I used to think I was better than that. I worked the late shift at a Conoco by the Roy Inks Bridge, the one with the bad ice machine and a wall of mounted fishing lures. 2 a.m, I would lock the door and mop, then step out under the buzzing lights to breathe and listen. The river would be down there in the dark, slurring over rock, and the wind would talk in the live oaks along the hill above town. If the moon was up, I could see Enchanted Rock like a pale shoulder far off, and if it wasn't, I could smell the caliche dust from County Road 307 whether a truck passed or not. Nights in Llano stretch. They show you the seams of your own thoughts. It is not a good place for an untested man to make a stand against a story everybody else already worked around. The first time I saw him, I wasn't thinking about any of that. It was a Tuesday in June and heat lightning had been walking along the horizon all evening. I closed up a little after 2, turned my key over in my hand and drove slow across the bridge. The river was wrinkled tin under me. I went past the courthouse, past the old feed store, and when I hit the rise where the town falls away into pasture and granite scrub, I glanced up out of habit at the mirror because a bobcat sometimes crossed there. In the center of the rear view, the ridge behind the Conoco drew itself like a black wave, and on the knife of it there was a man. He was too narrow at that distance to read a face. He was just a line, a note drawn with a stiff pen against the sky. He did not move. He did not need to. The hair on my forearms went alive like I had stepped into a current. I told myself what I was seeing was a cedar, a fence post, a trick of light that happens when your windshield has a smear and the glass picks up a ghost of something. I told myself this, and I kept my hands at 10 and 2, and by the time I made the left on 2323, the mirror had turned and all it could show was the black shout of the road behind, me and the little diamond of the bridge lamps fading. I breathed. I went home. I didn't think about it while I brushed my teeth in the dim of my bathroom, because my rental's light over the mirror had been flickering for a week, and I hadn't changed it. The second time I saw him, I pulled over. It was the same hour, different night. I had forgotten milk and had to go back in and buy the sad pint we kept for coffee. Leaving again, I paused on the exit, looked up without meaning to, and there he was. Not closer, not farther. Simply there, at the same place, on the same line of stone. If there had been a radio on, I would have turned the volume down to listen to him not making a sound. I eased my truck into the gravel like an old man easing into a pew. I stepped out. The world had the thin, fragile feel of a room after company has left. The insects were fierce with their singing. The ridge lay where it always lay. No man stood there. When I sat back down and shut the door, when I lifted my eyes, he was again the narrow cut against the sky, as if the glass held onto him when the open night could not. I drove home looking at my knees. I took a shower with the light off. The water blinded my eyes. When I tried to sleep, I saw the mirror and the ridge in it, and the man pinned there like a moth. There are people you can talk to in any town. If you want to hear something, you'll wish you didn't. That next afternoon, I walked over to the boot repair place, because it was the kind of place where men talk about things they won't say elsewhere, and because the owner, a sloped-shoulder man named Lyle, had lived his whole life 1 mile at a time up and down the same stretch of river. He was stitching a belt and the machine chuddered. I told him my AC was acting up and that the heat was making me see odd things. He did not bother to look up. When he finished the line and cut the thread, he said his cousin had pulled a horse trailer past midnight last winter and had hit the brakes on 152 because he thought he saw a man on the ridge above town. The mirror had showed it, and he had white-knuckled it all the way home. And the minute he turned into his long caliche driveway, he saw the thing in the glass tilt its narrow head toward the bit of house he could see between the oaks. The one with the porch light that burns all winter because his wife is the kind who is frightened of dark. He took down the rear view with a screwdriver the next morning and left it on the workbench and never put it back. The horse trailer backed itself crooked for months. Lyle said it as if it were nothing. He said there had been a dozen men over the years and a handful of women who had said something similar. None of them met the eyes of their mirrors while the telling was done. He said there were other things on other ridges out west by Big Bend if you wanted to go looking, but that this thing was local and old, and you didn't poke it. He said if you met it, you kept driving and you did not invite it any change in your life. If you were thinking of moving, you stayed. If you were thinking of leaving someone, you waited. The man on the ridge had a way of facing where your heart had already stepped without telling your feet, and it could draw that future down like a storm. I went home with my milk and a quiet. I had a girlfriend then. Sophia taught 4th grade and kept a jar of marbles on her classroom windowsill and drove a blue Civic with a cracked tail light, she said, gave it character. She stayed over most nights that summer. My house was not much. A rental with a leaning carport and chiggers in the patchy grass out back. The river was 3 blocks over and you could smell it in the morning like metal and fish and green. We ate tacos with foil still warm and watched the news and told ourselves we were going to take a Saturday and go to the Highland Lakes and swim. When I told her about the man, she made a face and said maybe we should go see a movie instead of talking nonsense. Then she sat back against the couch and went quiet in a way that made me know she was thinking of her own drives, her own small glances upward at glass. She said once that year she had looked up leaving school late and seen a shape on the ridge. This was before me. And she had turned the radio on loud and sung to drown it, and then taken a different route home, which is a strange thing to do in a town with only a handful of routes. I asked her where it pointed if it pointed. She said she refused to give it that. She said if there is a compass needle for what makes you return to the same table and the same bed every day, she didn't need some stranger on a hill to tell her which way it swung. I don't know when caution became obsession. Maybe the 4th time when the mirror didn't just show the man, but made me feel like he had a face pointing at a place that was me. The ridge is long, A fish's spine and a figure on it could stand north, south, east. Every driver swears it's the same place every time they see him. Not because he doesn't move, but because your house doesn't move. And he faces your house. I tried to trick it. I borrowed my friend's truck and drove his wife's route home and watched the silver square above the dash tell me the same story with a different ending. On the ridge, the man seemed to align to another part of the horizon. A twitch toward a fenced yard with a tire swing on a live oak, toward a tan house where a lab slept on the porch. I took a map, an actual paper one we kept at the station for tourists who still wanted to unfold their problems. I set it on the table and drew where I thought the line went each night using memory and guess. They converged the way stream beds gather on my small place near the river. I took Sophia out to the hill outside town before sunset. We parked, got out, stared at the same ridge with binoculars while the cedar waxwings chased insects. No man, who would expect one in daylight? Still, I felt the weight of him like someone else was in the conversation. Sophia is the one who asked an old woman at Babyhead Cemetery if she'd heard anything. The name of that place is a whole story by itself. One, people speak like a joke so they don't have to speak what it is. We took flowers for decency. The woman there wore a straw hat with a faded purple ribbon and rested on a folding chair while her little dog worried acorns. She said when she was a girl, her father would not let them look in mirrors after 9. He had something about the silver trapping things. He had fought grass fires and watched wind throw sparks ahead of the line. And he believed certain things ride light. She said the man on the ridge had first been spoken of after a flood when the river came, halfway up the courthouse steps, and carried a piano out of somebody's house and set it in a pasture, where cows stood around it like an idol. She said men on that flood crew swore a shape had stood on the ridge every night they worked. And every morning one of them would get home bone-tired to find some small accident had occurred to someone in their house. A slip on the back stairs. A dish shattered and cut a hand. A crib slat cracked and pinched the baby. Nothing deadly, not then. She said the city fixed the bridge and the river went on and the man stayed. She said he doesn't come to do a thing to you. He is the you that already did the thing. He is what you know waiting, and he is not interested in being your friend. I started seeing him on nights when I wasn't driving. My bathroom mirror caught him in a thin ghost the moment I leaned in to shave. The ridge boiled down to a shimmer and the man sat there like a nick in glass. The black screen of my phone in my palm picked him up for a heartbeat before the clock woke the pixels. When I angled the little toy mirror Sophia used to check if her students were on task behind her, the hill arrived as if my bathroom had a hidden window, and he stood in that window, quiet and distant, and turned toward us. I tried to talk like a rational person. I told myself this happens when you stare too long at something you half believe. The brain teaches itself tricks and cannot unlearn them. I went to a therapist in Marble Falls once and sat in a chair that made my knees point wrong and talked about loneliness and work and how late nights make a man feel like he's on the other side of glass from the rest of the county. I did not say the thing about the ridge. She said I should drink less coffee. I nodded and went home and lay beside my girlfriend thinking about all the lights I could see from our street. Little houses and trailers and porch bulbs under their eaves, each with people inside who knew without turning that after 9 o'clock, their town held a man upright in the distance. A needle on a dial, always facing toward wherever they kept their photographs and laundry basket, and the sound of their own breath in a pillow. It changed in August. That month everything shifts a little in hill country. The heat has had its victory and the grass gives up a smoke smell when you roll it between your fingers. The river drops to teeth. Lightning bugs give way to a hotter light on higher horizons, and every rustle starts to carry a premonition of deer season and the sound of old men oiling rifles in garages. The night it changed, Sophia fell asleep on the couch with a book on her chest and a glass sweating a ring on the coffee table under it. And I went out to buy something foolish, something that would keep me out an hour. I don't remember what, chips, a can of spray to kill ants, a new battery for the flashlight I didn't use. I took 16 out of town and hit the little dip past the nursery, where they sell rocks as if rocks were a crop. The mirror lifted my eye without my permission. I saw him as I always saw him, a black line that was also a man, and there was a more specific tilt to him than I had ever seen, as if a magnet had caught the inside of him and pulled his chest toward one precise point. That point was not my rental anymore. It was a notch in the ridge that matched the angle of someone else's roofline. For a second I felt free, the way you feel stepping out of an undertow and tasting air. Then I realized what roofline it was. It was the flat roof of the place where my mother slept alone up by the highway, in a low building with doors that all looked the same. I almost wrecked. I drove there with my hands wet and my heart wrong. I found her in a thin nightgown sitting up in bed like she had never stopped since the last time I saw her. Her roommate was a shape under a blanket in the other twin bed. The nurse came in and said Mom had fallen earlier. Nothing to be alarmed about, she was fine, they had checked her. The mirror in the bathroom off her room had a spiderweb crack at the corner, as if something had leaned its weight into it from outside. My mother held my hand and argued about money. The nurse checked my name again like that would matter if I pretended to be someone else. When I left, the ridge in my mirror had returned to its old, wrong allegiance, my house, the one by the river. I drove home slow as if a speed trap were not the state trooper under the oaks, but time itself. From then on, it was like living under a keystone. Everything else in your life can shift and settle. You can change jobs. You can put in a new faucet and marvel at water coming up clean. But that rock over you stays in place, and you measure every day by whether or not you're tired enough to forget it. I stopped shaving in front of the bathroom mirror. I replaced the rear view with a stick-on compass like something you buy in the camping aisle to tell yourself which way is north when you already know. I looked at windows only during daylight. I didn't tell Sophia about my mother because it would sound like a manipulation, and I didn't tell my mother about the mirror because it would sound like a failure. I thought about leaving. I thought about Austin, about San Marcos, about a condo near a HEB where the people do not know each other, where no ridge constitutes an opinion. But every time I pictured a new place, the man arranged himself toward it in the glass, a clean pivot, not menacing, just true. You can love a place and also be tired of the part of yourself that place insists on. And I loved Yano and was tired of being the man who was supposed to be fine. The night the fire sirens woke half the town, I was awake already. There was a noise in the back fence like someone trying a gate latch gently so as not to wake a dog. The dog did not exist, but my body heard it. I got up and went to the window and immediately stepped back because my own reflection unnerved me. I went to the kitchen and poured a glass of water and stood reading the ghost of my face in it. The scent came first, then the sound, then the color against the sky. It was not my street. It was across town, a garage breathing orange. Sophia came in bare feet, her hair a mess, her voice clearing itself as if it needed permission to speak. We walked out into the yard together and watched the glow wander over the tops of oaks. You learn to read distance from color out there. This was not our street and not my mother's place. This was the metal building near the old quarry. I thought of men inside it with welding masks and guessed a mistake, a tank too close to heat. I didn't feel anything so pedestrian as relief. Something else was in the light. Something too clean to be the aftermath of an accident. It felt like a story concluding that had not started in any of the rooms I knew. The next day, everyone had an opinion about how the fire started, and only one of them was true. An electrical short, said one. Kids, said another. Heat, said another. Lyle at the boot place said he had looked up in his mirror the night before and the ridge had pointed at his brother's house outside town, and he had sat in a chair till sunrise waiting for the phone to tell him a version of what the fire told. The phone told nothing. His brother woke up fine with a bad dream and no proof of it. The fire was a fire. The ridge was the ridge. The man was a man-shaped absence on rock. He was there to name the location of your helplessness. He wasn't there to sign for the delivery. I think it would have gone on like that for years if I had been the other version of myself. Men can be content with a burden as long as they get to keep calling it courage. But there was a pressure in me that prepared its own mistake. I started thinking you could interrupt a line by standing in it. I started thinking if the man on the ridge faced a house because I was heading there, then I could drag the point of his attention someplace else by changing what home meant, even if only for a night. I started driving at odd hours. I went to the Dairy Queen in town and ate a blizzard at midnight and watched the glass above my dash show me the ridge and the man cross his arms and tip his narrow head toward a little bungalow on a side street near the post office. I drove back roads to Lake Buchanan and sat on the dam looking out at black water and looked up at glass and watched him tilt to a lakeside house I had never seen the inside of, where a television made blue shadows on blinds. Home isn't a structure. It's the place where your body rehearses the same motions until the day it can't anymore. He kept telling me that. I did not hear it. The night it broke because of the smallest argument. I had left dishes in the sink again. Sophia had set them in a neat stack beside the faucet as if the control of it would make a difference. She didn't yell. She just didn't smile, and it made me feel like I was failing at something I would always fail. I walked out and sat in the truck and didn't start it for a while. When I did, the key turned like it wanted this. I pulled onto 16 and drove until town was a smear of orange behind me, and the ridge was a presence along my shoulder like an escort you didn't hire. I didn't look up. I made myself not look. I was good at that by then. The problem was the road curved and my eye tried to map what it didn't see into the curve. That's when the radio fuzzed. Not the station, the whole box. It made a full human-sized breath and then held it. I did what everyone does when their machine acts wrong. I slapped it lightly. The breath let out like a sigh. I laughed without humor, and then I looked up because you don't get to own your body when it believes something else is more important. He was closer. There is no distance without context, and the mirror gives you almost none, but I knew. He was at the near end of the ridge instead of the middle, and he seemed to stand not at the sky but in it, as if the glass had removed the ground for him and kept only the part meant to speak to me. He was tipped not toward my rental and not toward my mother's place, but toward a point that I understood without having to measure. It was the road I was on. It was my truck. That was the last clear second. The deer came out of the ditch like a question you don't get to answer. I braked. There was a rubber squeal that put teeth in my ears, the nose of the truck dove. The world spun a yard to the left. I missed the animal by the width of a wrist. The tires slid on caliche and gravel, and then found something that gripped. Everything slowed. Everything inside my head had enough time to lay options before me like cards. I could ride it straight and let the ditch take me, or I could pull right and try to save the truck and end up on my side. I could see the ridge in the mirror all the while like a lens inside a lens. The man quiet, his head turned toward the only shelter I had ever learned. I made a decision. It wasn't the right one. It was only mine. When I woke, the dome light was on. The windshield was a puzzle someone had shaken and not yet solved. There was a smell of dirt, and an old smell of something electrical that wasn't going anywhere. The night pressed its full weight to every window. I felt for blood like a man acting out a scene he saw on television. There was none, or enough of it was inside that it didn't concern me. My hands worked. My legs worked. I sat there a long time because when you have the chance to still be in a place and alive, you waste it on thinking. My phone didn't have a signal. The rear view had spun on its ball joint, cocked toward me like a broken eye. The ridge was in it. The ridge was always in it after dark. The man was close enough to read nothing. He stood with his head turned toward the left front corner of my truck. That was where the radiator hissed. That was where the future had its mouth open. What I remember from the rest has no sequence because the body doesn't arrange things by narrative when the real thing shows up. I remember the noise of cicadas sawing and then stopping all at once as if commanded. I remember a pair of headlights far off rounding a bend, then disappearing because the road there dips. I remember wanting very much to be in my own living room with the bad lamp on and the sound of Sophia breathing, and the ridiculous specificity of the rug under my bare feet with one loose thread I always worried at with my toes. I remember thinking if I sat perfectly still, the fact of me would not trickle away into the dirt and the air like everything else I had ever loved. I remember laughing once, short and voiceless, because the idea that a man on a ridge could tell you something about your life is funny if you look at it slant. A coyote spoke far away and the sound lifted out of the valley like something with wings too heavy to rise. The headlights came back around the bend and I saw they were not where I thought they were. They were higher. They were on the ridge road. They were turned in my direction and then they were not. They were there for somebody else's story. Mine had shrunk to the size of a cab smelling of dust and antifreeze. The last thing I did as myself is stupid and as right as anything I have ever done. I put my finger on the mirror and pushed it straight, leveled it so it aimed at my own eyes and not the ceiling. The man was unkind in how he didn't move because that is when you understand that nothing in the world has a mind to spare for you. He held the line where the sky ends and began to tilt toward a place beyond my truck. Not my rental, not my mother's place. I nearly smiled because I thought for a second I had cheated him. Then I understood what place it was. It was the house with the book on the coffee table and the water ring beneath. It was the neat stack of plates. It was the porch light I sometimes forgot to switch off. It was the one place in the county where the argument would be waiting to turn in the dark from anger into grief. He was facing the person who would stand in a doorway and hear the phone before it finished ringing. After that, there is wind and nothing in it. Then light and everything in it. Then the slow arrival of voices that say your name once to see if you have stayed. It is not a long story from there to here. It is a very long story from here to there, and I am on the long side of it. The ridge is colder than it looks. The wind collects smells from far fields and pushes them all together and lays them on your skin. You would imagine a height like this feels like power. It feels like a long hallway. It feels like being put at one end of a rule and told to represent it until the rule is done with you. I stand where he stood, and where the handful before me stood, and where the handful after me will stand. I do not hunger and I do not tire in a way that has anything to do with food or sleep. I face, that is the verb. It belongs to a neck and to a life. It belongs to the part of a town that believes in what it sees out of the corners of things. There are drivers tonight who keep the tape over their glass and move through the dark on faith and habit. There are those who look despite themselves and feel that jolt that says there is a line running from them to a house, and my body is the nail someone driven into the rock uses to show you the angle of that line. I try to turn away, I cannot. I try to lift my arm. Sometimes I do, and they mistake it for a warning or for a threat. It is neither. It is the gesture a drowning man makes to show the wave where to put him. When a car passes, the air it drags lifts my shirt and makes it slap my ribs. The old women of baby head still bring flowers. The bootman still cuts his thread off clean. The river still drags its shoulder along stone. In my better hours, I tell myself I am a courtesy as old as flood, as old as quarried granite, as old as the habit of returning to the same bed even when you are angry with the person in it. In my worse hours, I remember every face and every reflection that ever looked up at me, and I want to tell them I am not a danger they can outdrive. I am a direction they already chose. It isn't punishment, though it might be debt. It is not a haunting except in the part where a place gathers you and doesn't let go. The only words here are wind and a faint electricity when a storm is coming in over the lake. The only calendar is mesquite bud and leaf fall, and the day blue bonnets shove themselves out of rock like a dare. I would not call it lonely because that would mean I am still in the trade of thinking of myself as a person. I exist in their mirrors and sometimes in their windows and very rarely in the black skins of their phones when their thumbs hesitate before waking them. I exist when someone in a bedroom in town shakes a child and says it's time, and the child rolls toward the wall. I exist when a woman in a rental throws a washcloth over the bathroom mirror because the light flickers and she'll fix it when she has the money. I exist most when a driver with a cracked taillight turns off 16 for the last few blocks and counts, out of a habit I gave her, the breaths it will take to get from there to a door where someone will be waiting with a sentence already half said. I face her house more often than I admit to a wind. Sometimes she drives someone else's route and I turn for that, for the courtesy of keeping a consistent law. Sometimes she walks to the river with a coffee as the sky goes pewter, and I am not there at all because there are no small mirrors in what she is looking at then. She does not live the way she would have if I had stayed. She lives the way a person does when she is not owned by a story, and cannot help but be written into one. On those nights when she does drive back along the ridge and the glass tilts and I am in it, she brings her face forward and grips the wheel and does not look. The temptation to raise my arm again is strong. The temptation to point is unbearable. I am not allowed it as a choice. My hand comes up like a broken thing anyway, and the drivers who see me do not thank me or curse me. They get home. They walk across floors they bought or inherited. They stand in rooms that belong to them by law or by love or by habit. They look into their own small rectangles of silver to check a hair or wipe a smear, and they find me there in a shape that is also a lack of a shape, and they keep moving because that is what they have. I am the hill. I am the rule of it. I am the part of Llano that still shows you yourself when you thought you were done with that. Tonight the wind has turned and the courthouse clock is throwing time across town like a boy skimming stones. A truck rolls over the bridge with 2 kayaks strapped to its top like antlers. The driver is an old man and he will not look. The next is a welder with a burnt sleeve who stares and feels a pain in his chest he will tell himself about later, and then not. The next is a teacher with a cracked tail light and a marble jar, and she does not come this way often anymore, but she does tonight. She drives under the oaks that tunnel the road between town and that dark shine that is the river, and she holds the wheel light, the way you do when both hands know better than to ask for a grip that will never be given. She does not look up. She knows exactly where I am and what I am, I face not just the place on her street, but the precise room and the bit of floor where a water ring sits under a glass. My arm rises. My head turns with the intention of a compass. I am always facing the same direction, which is wherever you will end up when you have finished lying to yourself about where you belong. The rear view catches me and gives me to her and makes me the size of a postage stamp, and she does not look, and then she does, only for a half breath, and she does not flinch.
She drives on.
She gets home. She stands in a doorway and sets down her keys and runs her finger along the thread worked loose from the rug. She makes a small sound that turns an old argument into something else. She is safe. I am still here. The ridge is a blade against the town, and tonight it holds, as it always does, the shape of a man you cannot see until you make yourself small and reflective. He is always turned in the same direction. He always will be. The only kindness in it is that by the time you see me, you are already almost home.